I came back from a sunrise walk, expecting coffee and splashing from the pool. Instead, I found my 9-year-old adopted daughter, Lila, pulling sheets tight across my sister's bed while every cousin played outside. On the refrigerator was a chore list with one name on it, hers. Kendra barely looked up. She came later. She doesn't get the same privileges. Mom added, blood family comes first. I packed our bags without arguing. By dinner, I would learn that leaving the vacation was the smallest thing I had ended. Before I tell you how one handwritten list managed to change the shape of my family, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me to the end, and if stories about family, dignity, and the choices that change us mean something to you, I'd be glad to have you subscribe. 3 days earlier, Lila had been leaning so far between the front seats of my SUV that I had to remind her twice that seatbelts worked best when the person wearing them remained approximately inside the seat. July heat shimmered above the highway east of Raleigh, and every gas station we passed looked bleached by the same white North Carolina sun. The back of the car was packed with towels, sunscreen, 2 canvas bags, a cooler, and the inflatable pink flamingo Lila had insisted was essential survival equipment for the Outer Banks. She and Owen had spent most of the drive sending each other messages about the swimming pool at the rental house through the hotspot on my phone. Owen was 11, 2 years older than Lila, and had recently developed the unbearable confidence of a boy who had discovered that being taller than somebody could be treated as a universal credential. His younger sister, Ruby, was 8, and generally sided with whichever person looked most likely to share snacks. Lila twisted around. After another message arrived on the old Wi-Fi iPad, I let her use for family calls and games. Her mouth tightened in mock outrage. Owen had apparently announced that the last cousin into the pool would have to do dishes. Then I hope you like soap, she dictated back with great satisfaction. That was Lila. She hated losing more than she hated Brussels sprouts, and she had once demanded a rematch after losing a coin toss because, according to her, the wind had been suspicious. She had never been a child who waited quietly at the edge of a room hoping someone would invite her in. She walked toward whatever interested her and assumed the rest of us would keep up. It was one of the things I loved most about her. Lila had come to live with me at the end of 2019, when she was about 2.5. The adoption became final in 2021. By 9, she understood what adoption meant in the practical, age-sized way children understand most important things. She had been born to one woman, raised by another, and both facts could exist without canceling each other out. I had never wanted the truth to arrive one day like a trapdoor beneath her feet, so we had always spoken about it plainly. What I had been less honest about mostly with myself was how badly I wanted my extended family to become effortless for her. Owen had been born in 2015, Ruby in 2018. They had existed in my mother's arms, in my sister Kendra's holiday cards, in our family photographs, before Lila entered any of those rooms. Chronologically, she had come later. I knew that. What I had never believed was that anyone I loved might turn chronology into rank. At the time, I still carried a simpler theory. Give children enough ordinary time together, and belonging would follow. Not ceremonies. Not speeches. Just pool days, birthdays, pizza on paper plates, arguments over board games, car rides, inside jokes. I thought familiarity could do what adults sometimes failed to say aloud. That was one reason I had agreed to the trip. Kendra had found the Outer Banks rental in the spring and presented it as 4 days of cousins being cousins, while the adults tried not to work. My mother, Marilyn, was thrilled. Evan, Kendra's husband, mostly cared that the place had an outdoor grill and enough parking. Before that trip, Kendra had taken Lila out with Owen and Ruby a few times without me. For ice cream, mini golf, ordinary cousin afternoons I had never thought twice about. Lila had initially shrugged at the invitation until she heard the words private pool. Then she wanted to know exactly how early we could leave Raleigh. By the time we reached the coast, the air smelled of salt and sun-warmed wood. The rental stood several rows back from the ocean, raised high on pilings, with weathered gray siding and a narrow deck wrapped around the second floor. The pool behind it was smaller than it had looked in the listing photographs, but Lila treated it as if Kendra had rented the Atlantic itself. She and Owen bolted toward the bedrooms before I had finished carrying the first bag inside. Kendra intercepted them halfway up the stairs and announced that Owen and Ruby could choose first because they had been doing family trips like this longer. She said it lightly, already balancing room keys and grocery bags in both hands. Owen took the room with the bunk bed. Ruby claimed the one with seashells painted on the dresser. Lila ended up in the smaller room near mine. I noticed the phrasing. I also noticed that Owen was older. Ruby was Kendra's younger child, and Kendra had booked the house. There were half a dozen harmless explanations available, and I reached for one of them because that was what reasonable people did when a family vacation had barely begun. Lila rolled her suitcase inside, examined the narrow bed, and declared that at least she was closer to the bathroom than Owen was. Then she smirked like someone who had just won a strategic war. The moment passed. That afternoon the kids spent almost 3 hours in the pool. Lila and Owen invented a race involving the pink flamingo, 2 foam noodles, and rules so inconsistent that each child accused the other of corruption. Ruby floated around them wearing goggles upside down, and occasionally announced herself the winner of contests she had not entered. The sound of their arguing carried through the screen door while I helped unpack groceries. That was the picture I had wanted when I said yes to the trip. Not perfection. Ordinary noise. My mother sat at the kitchen island slicing peaches while Kendra organized food into cabinets with the seriousness of a woman planning a military deployment. Marilyn was 65 that summer, still energetic, still incapable of entering anyone's kitchen without rearranging at least one thing. She watched the children through the glass and made one of those comments older relatives sometimes make about the kids carrying the family forward. It was not aimed at Lila. At least not openly. Marilyn had used bloodline language all my life. Family name, family resemblance, our people, your grandfather's chin, your aunt's stubborn streak. She was the kind of woman who could identify which side of the family your elbows came from. I felt the familiar pinch of discomfort and let it pass. Kendra barely reacted. To her, language like that had always been wallpaper. Evan was outside trying to coax the grill into cooperating. Every few minutes the igniter clicked uselessly, followed by a muffled curse he was clearly attempting to keep below child hearing volume. Owen finally leaned over the deck rail and informed him that the grill might work better if he turned the gas on first. Evan stared at the propane tank for a long second. The children howled. Even I laughed. Nothing about that evening felt like the beginning of a rupture. We ate grilled chicken, corn, peaches, and whatever Ruby had done to a bowl of tortilla chips while no one was watching. Lila and Owen argued about who had cheated during the flamingo race. Marilyn told them both to stop talking with their mouths full. Kendra made a schedule for the next day that included beach time, lunch, and an afternoon trip for ice cream. I went to bed believing the first day had been mostly successful. The following morning, I woke before everyone else. Sunrise had always been my favorite hour at the coast, before the traffic and umbrellas and sunscreen turned the place into a vacation. The air was cooler then. The dunes held long shadows. You could hear gulls before you heard people. Lila was still asleep when I pulled on walking shoes. I left a note on the counter saying I would be back within an hour and took the boardwalk toward the beach. For 45 minutes, the world felt uncomplicated. The ocean was gray-blue beneath a thin pink sky. My shoes collected sand at the edges of the tide. A few runners passed me. Someone farther down the beach walked a golden retriever that kept trying to carry pieces of driftwood twice its size. I remember that morning so clearly because of how ordinary my thoughts were. Coffee. Whether Lila had remembered to hang her wet swimsuit. Whether we had enough sunscreen for 4 days. Whether Owen would demand a rematch in the pool before breakfast. I had no reason to imagine that, while I was walking, Kendra was changing the rules inside the house. When I came back, the sun was already higher, and the wood beneath the outdoor stairs had begun to warm. I heard the children before I reached the kitchen level. A splash. Owen shouting something about a cannonball. Ruby shrieking with laughter. The kind of noise that usually told me exactly where Lila would be. I stepped inside and dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl near the door. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and laundry detergent. Kendra stood near the counter, tapping at her phone. Marilyn was rinsing fruit. I glanced toward the pool through the glass doors. Owen was in the water. Ruby sat on the edge, kicking her feet. Lila was not there. At first I assumed she was changing. Then I heard the soft scrape of furniture from the hallway. Not a crash. Not a child running. A steady drag. I followed the sound. Lila was in Kendra and Evan's bedroom. She had stripped one side of the bed and was pulling a fitted sheet over the mattress. At 9 years old, her arms were not quite long enough to manage a king-size bed gracefully, so she had one knee pressed into the mattress while she fought the corner elastic into place. A folded pile of towels sat on the chair behind her. Her swimsuit was under her t-shirt. Her hair was already tied up for the pool. She looked at me when I stopped in the doorway, and for one brief second, something crossed her face that I had never seen there during a family visit. Embarrassment. Not fear. Not guilt. The embarrassment of being caught in a position she had not chosen and did not know how to explain. My eyes moved from the bed to the towels, then back toward the kitchen. That was when I saw the sheet of paper taped to the refrigerator. At the top, in Kendra's square handwriting, were the words, "Morning chores." Underneath were several ordinary tasks: make beds, collect towels, straighten the upstairs bathroom, put breakfast dishes in the dishwasher. There was nothing dangerous on the page, nothing a 9-year-old was physically incapable of doing. That was almost what made it worse. Beside every task was the same name: Lila. No Owen, no Ruby, only hers. The sounds from the pool pressed through the glass behind me, bright and careless. A blue foam noodle flew briefly above the fence and disappeared again. I pulled the paper from the refrigerator. The tape made a dry, tearing sound. Kendra looked up from her phone. I asked why Lila was the only child on the list. There are moments when you expect another person to give you an explanation that will let reality remain mostly intact. A misunderstanding. A joke that had gone too far. Lila had volunteered. The others had chores later. Kendra gave me none of those. She glanced toward the hallway, as if I had asked why one towel was blue and another was white. She came later. She doesn't get the same privileges. For a second, the paper in my hand seemed louder than the whole room. Marilyn stopped rinsing peaches. I looked at my mother. She did not ask what Kendra meant. She did not look surprised. Her mouth tightened with the weary impatience of someone who believed a simple family rule was being unnecessarily challenged. Blood family comes first. That was all. No shouting, no confession, no dramatic secret. Just 2 sentences placed beside a handwritten list. And suddenly all the little things I had been willing to explain separately no longer sat separately. First pick. Carrying the family forward. Coming later. Different rules. The paper bent under my fingers. I set it down on the counter before I crushed it. Then I walked back to the bedroom. Lila had stopped making the bed. One corner of the fitted sheet had snapped loose again, leaving a pale diagonal wrinkle across the mattress. She stood beside it with her hands hanging at her sides. I told her to change into dry clothes. She looked toward the window. From that room you could see only a slice of blue pool between neighboring houses, but Owen's voice carried clearly enough. Lila's jaw shifted. Was I invited, or was I here to help? The question landed far harder than anything Kendra had said. There was no adult philosophy in it. No speech about adoption. No accusation she had practiced. Just a 9-year-old trying to understand why everyone else had come on vacation while she had been assigned to make their beds. I told her we were going home. I packed fast. There was nothing cinematic about it. I rolled damp swimsuits into a plastic grocery bag. I shoved chargers into side pockets. I left unopened snacks in the pantry and nearly forgot Lila's sandals under her bed. Kendra followed me only once, trying to reduce what had happened to a disagreement over chores. I did not argue. There was nothing useful left to learn from hearing the same hierarchy translated into softer words. Marilyn stayed near the kitchen. Evan was still outside with the children and had not seen the list. I did not know that yet. I carried the first bags down the stairs, then the second. Lila came behind me with the pink flamingo wedged awkwardly beneath one arm. That detail nearly broke me. The ridiculous inflatable bird looked too cheerful for the moment. Its painted black eyes stared sideways as she tried to force it into the back of the SUV. I took it from her and pressed the valve until the air began to hiss out. Neither of us said much. As we pulled away, the house disappeared behind a row of dunes and rental signs. Lila watched through the passenger window. For the first hour, she barely moved. I did not fill the silence with assurances I had not earned. When she finally spoke, she asked whether Grandma really believed blood came first. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. The old answer rose automatically inside me. She loves you. I had said versions of that sentence before whenever Marilyn used clumsy language. I had treated love like evidence strong enough to cancel everything surrounding it. This time I could not say it. Not because I believed Marilyn had never loved Lila, because love was no longer the question. By early afternoon we were back in Raleigh. The house felt strangely cool after the coast. Lila carried her bag upstairs and closed her bedroom door without slamming it. That restraint hurt more than a slam would have. I unpacked mechanically. Wet towels into the washer, cooler emptied. Sand shaken from shoes on the back step. The ordinary work of returning home continued, as if the reason we had returned were ordinary too. Around 6 that evening, my phone rang. Evan's name appeared on the screen. I almost let it go. Then I answered, because Evan had not been in the kitchen when I found the list, and I did not yet know what he had seen or been told. He skipped any attempt at small talk. He told me that after we left, Kendra had described the situation as an overreaction to a few chores. He had initially assumed there had been some argument between sisters that he had missed. Then dinner happened. Owen had apparently asked why Lila had been making beds, if coming into the family later had nothing to do with making beds. Ruby, trying to help, had added that Kendra had told them before the trip that things would work a little differently for Lila because she had joined the family later. That was when Evan understood the list had not been a spontaneous request for help. Whatever Kendra had prepared the children to expect, the difference had existed before I ever saw the paper on the refrigerator. I stood at my kitchen counter listening to the refrigerator hum. On the other end of the call, Evan sounded less angry than unsettled. He said he had asked Kendra one question after the kids left the table. What does blood have to do with making beds? His voice dropped. She didn't have an answer. I looked toward the stairs, where Lila had disappeared hours earlier with a deflated pink flamingo tucked beneath her arm. That morning, Kendra had thought I was ending a vacation. By dinner, one of her own children had started questioning the rule she had expected him to inherit. For several seconds after Evan hung up, I stayed where I was, one hand resting on the edge of the kitchen counter, and the other still holding my phone. The refrigerator motor clicked off, and the sudden quiet made the house feel larger than it was. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked once beneath Lila's room. I could picture her moving around behind the closed door, maybe unpacking, maybe doing nothing at all. A few hours earlier, I had believed getting her out of that rental house was the clearest decision I would have to make. Evan's call had complicated that illusion. Kendra had prepared the children to expect some kind of difference before we arrived. I still did not know exactly what she had told them, only that Owen had already begun questioning the logic behind it. I did not go upstairs immediately. That would have been my old instinct to carry new information straight to Lila because truth had always mattered so much between us. But truth did not have to arrive the minute I received it. She had already absorbed enough adult failure for one day. I set my phone face down and stood at the sink until the sensation returned to the fingers that had been wrapped too tightly around it. During the drive back from the Outer Banks, I had apologized once, not for leaving. I would never apologize for that. I apologized because I had not seen clearly enough what I had been asking Lila to walk into every time I encouraged another family weekend, another birthday, another afternoon at Marilyn's house. I had kept believing ordinary contact would smooth out whatever awkwardness existed around adoption. If there had been a sharp edge, I assumed time would wear it down. Lila had not answered me then. She had watched rows of pines slide past her window as the coast disappeared behind us. Her knees were pulled toward the dashboard, sneakers braced against the floor mat, and the deflated pink flamingo lay folded in the back seat, like something that had died from embarrassment. The only movement in the car had been the occasional tightening of her mouth whenever we passed another vehicle loaded with beach chairs. I had wanted to tell her I had never known Kendra thought that way. The sentence would have been true. It also would have been incomplete. I had known my mother cared too much about bloodline, seen Kendra treat family traditions as if they came with ownership papers, and noticed first pick comments that were easy to explain one at a time. I had simply never assembled them into the thing Lila had been forced to see all at once. So instead of defending myself, I had told her I should have paid closer attention. She had turned her face farther toward the window. That silence followed us all the way home. By the time Evan called that evening, exhaustion had settled over the house in layers. I had unpacked enough to keep wet clothes from souring and abandoned the rest. Lila had taken a shower and changed into an oversized t-shirt, but she had not come downstairs looking for dinner. On ordinary nights, she would have appeared before I finished opening the refrigerator, asking what we had and rejecting half of it before I had named the options. I did not have the energy to cook. I ordered fries, chicken strips, and 2 milkshakes from a place near us that Lila liked, then left the paper bag on the kitchen island without calling her down. The smell traveled upstairs on its own salt, hot oil, that faint sweetness fast food fries have when they are still trapped in a closed bag. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard her door open. She came down slowly, one hand sliding along the stair rail. Her hair was still damp at the ends. She stopped at the island and looked inside the bag before looking at me. "I'm still mad at you," she said. "I'm not mad at fries." It was the first thing she had said to me in nearly an hour. Something in my chest loosened just enough to let air through. I put one carton on a plate and pushed it toward her. I did not tease her or use the tiny crack in the tension to pretend we were fine. She sat on a stool, dipped one fry in ketchup, and ate with the solemn concentration of someone unwilling to let good potatoes get involved in a family dispute. We stayed there for a while, neither of us rushing. The difference between a child's anger and an adult's anger is not that one is simpler. Sometimes it is only less disguised. Lila did not spend 20 minutes explaining that she felt disappointed in my judgment. She did not frame her feelings carefully enough to protect mine. She ate 6 fries, peeled a strip of paper from the edge of the carton, and then asked the question she had apparently been carrying since the drive home. Why had I kept making her go to family things, if I had heard Grandma talk about blood before? I could have corrected the premise. I had never forced her to every birthday. She had enjoyed plenty of those gatherings. She loved Owen and Ruby. Marilyn had not spent years openly insulting her. All of that was true, and none of it answered what Lila was actually asking. She wanted to know why my hope had been allowed to outrank my discomfort. I looked down at the untouched milkshake, sweating against my palm. I told her I had believed the small differences would fade if everyone had enough time together. I had wanted her to have cousins she grew up with, and a grandmother whose house felt familiar. I had wanted the family I grew up in to become hers, without requiring her to keep examining where the seams were. Lila scraped one fry through a puddle of ketchup until the red line became a circle. Did you need me to like being with them more than I did? There was no accusation in her voice strong enough to hide behind. That made it worse. She was 9. She did not have words for the pressure adults can put on children when we want a picture to become real badly enough. She only knew that sometimes I had encouraged her to stay a little longer at Marilyn's, to join another cousin outing, to give Kendra another chance when she found her bossy. I had called it family time. To Lila, it had begun to look like I had been grading her enthusiasm. I put the milkshake down. The easy response would have been to tell her no, but there had been a piece of yes inside my behavior, even if I had never intended it that way. I told her I had wanted it too much, not because there was anything wrong with the family we had at home, but because somewhere along the way, I had started treating extended family acceptance like something I could secure for her if I kept enough doors open. Lila stared at the fries. Then she asked if we had to see Kendra again. I said no decision had to be made that night. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. That was the first lesson the day had forced on me that I could actually use. Protecting Lila did not mean replacing Kendra's control with mine. My phone began vibrating on the counter before we had finished eating. Kendra. I let the first call end. A message appeared a minute later. She said I had humiliated everyone, scared the children, wasted money, and turned a few chores into an accusation about adoption. The words came wrapped in the tidy logic she always used when she wanted to move a disagreement onto ground she controlled. If the argument was about chores, I looked dramatic. If it was about leaving the vacation, I looked impulsive. If it was about money, I looked selfish. The only framing she could not survive was the actual one. Why had only one child been assigned the work? I sent exactly that. I did not mention what Evan had told me yet. I did not quote Owen or Ruby. Children were not going to become ammunition in a text fight between adults if I could help it. Kendra's next response was longer. I could see the gray typing indicator appear, vanish, then appear again. I turned the phone over before the message arrived. Marilyn tried the gentler version later that night. She did not defend the list directly. Instead, she suggested everyone had been tired. Emotions had been high, and nothing good would come from making permanent decisions while angry. The language sounded reasonable until I noticed what was missing. She did not ask how Lila was doing. She asked when I thought things might calm down. I told her I was not discussing family peace, while Lila was still trying to understand why Grandma had put blood ahead of her. I did not stay on the phone long enough for the conversation to circle back into intention. When I returned to the kitchen, Lila had finished the fries and left the milkshake half full. She had taken the paper bag upstairs with her trash inside it, something she normally had to be reminded to do. That tiny act stopped me near the sink. I did not want her becoming more careful, because adults had made her feel like a burden. I carried the remaining food into the refrigerator and left the light over the stove on. The next morning, the house woke differently. Lila usually appeared in my bedroom before 7:30, on summer mornings claiming she was starving, despite having eaten a bedtime snack. Instead, I found her curled sideways on the couch, after 9 with a blanket over her legs and cartoons playing quietly. Her iPad sat on the coffee table. She was not using it. I made breakfast and did not mention the device. For most of that day, we avoided family. We walked to a neighborhood park in the afternoon, though Lila abandoned the playground after 10 minutes because the metal slide was too hot. We bought lemonade from a stand run by 2 children, who had priced every cup differently depending on how much change they thought the customer possessed. Lila spent the walk home, explaining why their business model was doomed. The humor came back in flashes, so did the anger. A delivery van blocked our driveway when we returned, and Lila snapped that people should not get to take something just because they got there first. She heard herself, stopped, and kicked a pebble toward the gutter. I did not point out the connection. Some emotions need room before they can tolerate analysis. That evening I asked only one question about what came next. whether she wanted me to stop Owen and Ruby from contacting her. Lila's answer was immediate. No. Kendra and Marilyn were different. She did not want to see either of them. She did not want another grandma afternoon. She did not want to go back to the vacation house, even if I told her Kendra had apologized. But cousins were harder. Owen had been in the pool while she worked. That hurt. Ruby had been there too, but they were also the children who had built blanket forts with her in Marilyn's living room, argued over pizza crust, traded Halloween candy, and once spent an entire afternoon trying to teach Marilyn's ancient television remote to respond to voice commands. Lila was angry with them. She also missed them. Those two facts did not cancel each other. I told her she did not have to make one family-sized decision. She could decide person by person, and she could change her mind later. That seemed to interest her more than any reassurance I had offered since we left the coast. The next afternoon, 2 days after the vacation ended, she finally turned on the iPad. It was an older one, Wi-Fi only, with a cracked protective case and enough parental controls to make downloading a new game feel like applying for a mortgage. I had approved Owen and Ruby on a family-safe messaging app months earlier because it let the cousins send ridiculous stickers without anyone needing social media accounts. A notification badge sat over Owen's name. Lila saw it and froze with one finger above the screen. I was across the room folding towels. She glanced at me. I told her she did not have to open it. She did anyway. Owen's message was short enough that I could read it only after Lila turned the screen toward me. He said he was sorry he had kept swimming while she was making beds. He said he had not thought about it. Nothing more. No adult wording. No polished apology. Lila stared at the message for several seconds, then put the tablet down. She did not reply. I liked Owen more for the fact that he had not tried to make himself sound better than he had been. He was 11. He had been handed a privilege, told it was normal, and used it. That did not erase the harm. It did make the situation different from a child intentionally humiliating another child. Still, I did not say any of that to Lila. She was allowed to be angry before she was asked to understand someone else. The tablet stayed face down on the coffee table until evening. By the third day, parts of our normal rhythm had started returning. I worked for a few hours at the dining table, while Lila built something in a game beside me. She complained about the Wi-Fi, accused the dog next door of barking specifically to annoy her, and ate cereal from a mug, because every clean bowl was in the dishwasher. Then the tablet chimed again. This time she opened the message without looking at me first. I noticed her stop chewing. The spoon stayed halfway between the mug and her mouth. She read the screen twice. Then she slid off the chair and brought it to me. Owen had written more this time, but not much. He said he wanted Lila to know that his mother had told him and Ruby before the trip that Lila would be helping more around the house. He had not questioned it because Kendra explained that Lila had joined the family later. For a second, all I heard was the soft cycling sound of the dishwasher behind us. The message did not reveal another chore list. It did not tell me Kendra had been secretly using Lila for months. In some ways, that would have been easier to understand. This was smaller and deeper. Kendra had prepared her children to expect inequality before Lila even walked into the rental house. That meant Owen had not stood in the pool that morning and watched something surprising happen. He had been watching a rule unfold the way his mother had told him it would. Ruby had too. Lila held the iPad against her stomach. Her face looked different from the way it had in Kendra's bedroom. The humiliation was still there, but something harder had joined it. She was not trying to figure out whether she had misunderstood anymore. She was trying to figure out how many other people had understood before she did. I put my hand on the back of the dining chair, but did not reach for her. Lila had never liked being touched when she was angry. When she was little, hugs could fix almost anything. At 9, sometimes the kindest thing I could give her was space measured in inches. She looked down at Owen's message again, then up at me. So they knew the rules before I did? So they knew the rules before I did? Lila's question stayed between us long after the screen on her iPad dimmed. I did not answer immediately, because I had learned, in the 3 days since we left the coast, that my first answer was often the one designed to make the room hurt less. It was the answer that said maybe, probably not. I'm sure they didn't mean it that way. Those answers had protected adults from discomfort far more often than they had protected Lila from anything. I pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. Owen's message proved one narrow thing. Before the trip, Kendra had told the children Lila would help more because she had joined the family later. It did not tell us what Ruby had understood, or what either child had made of that rule, and I was not going to build the rest of the story for them. I told Lila only what we actually knew, and left the unanswered parts unanswered. Lila pressed the edge of the tablet case against the table until the rubber bent inward. She asked whether she needed to tell me everything else that had ever happened with Kendra. The question tightened something behind my ribs. 3 days earlier, I might have started asking for examples. Had there been other chores? Had Kendra said anything before? Had Marilyn? Had Owen? The protective part of me wanted a complete map of every moment I might have missed. But Lila was not evidence. She was my daughter. I told her she did not have to make a list for me. She did not have to remember every strange comment, prove a pattern, or help me build a case against people I was already capable of judging by what they had done in front of me. If she wanted to tell me something later, I would listen. If she did not, I would not keep digging until every family memory had been turned over. Her fingers relaxed around the tablet. That was the first time since the vacation that I saw relief reach her before sadness did. It was small, her shoulders lowered, her back touched the chair. She set the iPad flat, instead of holding it against her body like a shield. We did not talk about Kendra again that afternoon. I thought giving Lila control would make the house feel normal faster. It did not. The damage followed us into ordinary things. 2 mornings later, I found a cereal bowl, a spoon, and an empty juice glass on the coffee table. Lila had been building a puzzle on the floor and watching a nature show with the volume too low to hear from the kitchen. Normally, I would have called her back to clear the dishes before she started something else. That morning, I almost carried them away myself. My hand was already around the glass when I stopped. That was not fairness either. If I suddenly removed every responsibility from Lila's life, because Kendra had used responsibility as a weapon, I would be teaching her that ordinary chores and humiliation were the same thing. I set the glass back down. I asked her to bring her breakfast things to the kitchen when she finished the section of the puzzle she was working on. Lila's head came up too quickly. The nature documentary kept playing behind her, some calm British voice describing a bird building a nest. Is this because I'm adopted? There it was. Not anger this time. Suspicion. The question hit me harder than I expected because it had entered our house so easily. Before the vacation, Lila could complain about chores with the dedication of any healthy 9-year-old. She had argued that matching socks should count as 2 jobs because there were 2 socks. She had once tried to negotiate a reduction in bedroom cleanup on the grounds that the mess was mostly vertical. She had never once asked whether I expected something from her, because she was adopted. Kendra had put that question into her head in one morning. I sat on the edge of the armchair instead of answering from across the room. I told her no. The dishes had nothing to do with adoption. They had nothing to do with Owen or Ruby either. In our house, we cleaned up the things we used because that was part of living together. Lila narrowed her eyes and glanced around the room as if conducting an audit. That's a very convenient rule when everybody is just us. The corner of my mouth moved before I could stop it. She saw it. For half a second, she looked offended that I might find her funny. Then her own mouth twitched. The tension broke just enough. She carried the bowl and glass to the kitchen. She left the spoon on the coffee table. I did not call her back. There were moments worth winning, and moments worth letting a spoon sit where it was. The question stayed with me even when Lila did not say it aloud. If I reminded her to bring a towel inside after running through the sprinkler, she watched my face for an extra beat. If I told her she could not download a game without asking first, she wanted to know whether Owen had the same rule at his house. Once, when I said no ice cream before dinner, she asked whether Ruby was allowed to have it. I did not know, and saying so irritated her more than a no. The vacation had made ordinary boundaries feel unstable. I still had to parent her. I just needed the reasons behind our rules to remain predictable and unrelated to how she had entered the family. By the end of the week, I scheduled a consultation with a therapist who had experience working with adoptive families. I went alone. The office was on the second floor of a converted brick house near downtown Raleigh, with pale walls, a humming air conditioner, and a waiting room full of children's books that had clearly been selected by someone who understood that nervous parents read titles too. I did not go because I thought something was wrong with Lila. I went because I did not trust myself to improvise my way through the aftermath without accidentally making adoption the explanation for every emotion she had. For most of the session, I described what had happened in straightforward terms. The vacation, the list, Kendra's words, Marilyn's response, Lila's questions afterward. The therapist spent more time asking what rules had looked like in our home before the vacation than telling me what to do next. By the time I left, one distinction was clear. Removing every expectation from Lila would still make adoption the center of our household, only in the opposite direction. What she needed was predictable rules, with reasons she could understand and question reasons that had nothing to do with how she had joined our family. I did not repeat the therapist's language to Lila that evening. That would have sounded absurd coming from me, and even more absurd to her. Instead, when she left art supplies across the dining table after dinner, I asked her to put them away before bedtime. She groaned. I reminded her the same way I would have 2 weeks earlier. She complained that the markers were organized enough. I told her the dining table was not a marker habitat. She rolled her eyes so dramatically. I thought she might injure something. And then she cleaned them up. I stood at the sink rinsing a plate and listened to her muttering about oppressive table policies under her breath. The sound warmed the room. It was ordinary resistance. I had never been so grateful for it. Evan called the next afternoon. By then, a full week had passed since the vacation. I was outside trimming dead leaves from a basil plant that had somehow survived both July heat and my neglect. Lila was inside doing something on the iPad that involved music, digital animals, and occasional furious tapping. Evan told me he had finally spoken to Owen and Ruby separately. He had not treated it like an interrogation. He had simply wanted to know what each child thought the rules had been before we arrived at the rental house. Owen's account matched the message he had already sent Lila. Ruby's added something broader. Kendra had told her Lila would not get first picks because she had come later. There was no secret punishment system and no history of hidden chores. The consistency lay in the rule itself, different words, same hierarchy. Evan also answered a question I had not asked him directly. He had not seen the chore list before I found it. That morning, while I was walking, Kendra had sent him outside with Owen and Ruby because the kids were already asking to swim. He had taken towels, water bottles, and sunscreen with him. By the time he came back inside after I had left with Lila, the list was no longer on the refrigerator. I leaned one forearm against the deck railing. That detail mattered, but not because it absolved Evan. He had missed something happening under his own roof, just as I had missed things in my family. The difference was that he was beginning to examine his absence instead of using it as proof that nothing had happened. He admitted as much without dressing it up. For years, he had treated Kendra's management of family gatherings as her territory. She handled invitations, rooms, meal plans, birthdays, which cousin sat where, who brought what. He handled his own pieces and left the rest alone. Until that week, he had considered that division efficient. Now he was beginning to understand that disengagement could still have consequences. I did not comfort him. He was 41 years old. He did not need me to tell him he had done his best. He needed to decide what he would do next. Before we ended the call, he asked if Ruby could speak to me for a minute. She had apparently been hovering close enough to hear her name, despite being told to give him privacy. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table. Lila looked up from the couch when she saw me put the call on speaker. I asked whether she wanted to stay. She did. Evan remained beside Ruby. I could hear small movements on their end fabric rubbing against the phone, the faint echo of a room larger than ours. I did not ask Ruby questions. That mattered. Children will try to supply the answer they think adults want, especially when everyone around them has become tense. I was not going to make an 8-year-old responsible for proving her mother wrong. Ruby spoke because she wanted to. She said she had thought Lila understood how the trip worked. Then, in the same casual tone she might have used to explain whose turn it was to choose a movie, she repeated the rule she believed Kendra had given them. Mom said Lila gets last picks because she came later. The room went still. Lila was sitting cross-legged on the couch, one hand wrapped around her ankle. She did not flinch. She just stared at the speaker. Ruby kept going for another few seconds, mostly trying to explain that she had not known. Lila did not know. Evan gently stopped her before she began taking responsibility for fixing something she had not created. I was grateful for that. No one asked Ruby to apologize. She was 8, repeating a rule an adult had taught her. When the call ended, Lila quietly carried her water glass back to the kitchen after setting it down on the coffee table. A week earlier I might not have noticed. Now I could see her checking whether an ordinary rule in our house stayed ordinary. The house filled again with the air conditioner, a lawnmower down the street, and music from Lila's tablet. But Ruby's sentence stayed with me. Until then, I had focused on what the hierarchy had taken from Lila. I had spent less time considering what it was giving Owen and Ruby, an expectation that their choices should come first for reasons that had nothing to do with age, safety, ability, or need. That evening, while Lila searched under her bed for a charger she accused of being bad at staying put, the larger problem became harder to ignore. I could prevent another chore list, or another vacation under Kendra's rules. I could not erase a belief merely by removing Lila from the room. Owen and Ruby had been learning from it too, and they would have to decide what to do with what they had been taught. 2 days later, Evan called again. This time his voice sounded tired rather than unsettled. He said he had spent the week noticing phrases he had previously ignored, small assumptions in the way Kendra talked about who belonged where, who had been in the family longest, who deserved first choice. He did not claim every comment was proof of prejudice. He simply said he was no longer willing to treat the pattern as invisible. Then he paused long enough that I heard a cabinet close somewhere behind him. "I thought Kendra was organizing a vacation," he said. "I'm starting to think she was teaching a rule." "I thought Kendra was organizing a vacation," Evan had said. "I'm starting to think she was teaching a rule." His words followed me into the next week, surfacing while I folded Lila's towels, waited at red lights, or watched her argue with an orange juice cap. What troubled me was not the possibility of another obviously cruel act. I knew how to remove Lila from one of those. A family rule could survive much longer simply because people had stopped asking where it came from. Kendra called 2 days later. I almost let it go to voicemail. Lila was in the backyard drawing a starting line on the patio with sidewalk chalk for a race no one else had agreed to participate in. I could see the top of her head through the kitchen window, bent in concentration as she added arrows and what looked suspiciously like penalty zones. I stepped into the laundry room before answering. Kendra did not waste time with pleasantries. She had apparently decided that if she could reduce the problem to something small enough, I would eventually feel embarrassed for having reacted so strongly. She accused me of turning ordinary chores into an adoption issue, arguing that families gave children different responsibilities and that traditions had existed before Lila joined us. The wording shifted, but the center did not. She needed a reason Lila could come second, without calling it second. I listened until she began talking about how much money had been wasted on the vacation. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Why was Lila the only name on the list? Kendra went quiet. Not long. Just long enough. When she answered, she shifted back to seniority. She said the children who had been part of family traditions longer naturally had certain privileges. She called it normal. She called it practical. She said Lila had not been punished. She had simply been expected to contribute differently. I looked through the laundry room doorway at the kitchen beyond it. A damp swimsuit still hung over the back of a chair. The pink flamingo, reinflated halfway, was wedged against the mudroom wall, because Lila had decided it deserved rehabilitation. There was something almost absurd about hearing Kendra explain a family ranking system while a plastic bird stared at me with painted eyes. I did not argue with her definition of normal. I told her normal was not the same as fair. Then I ended the call before we could start circling. Kendra had always been good at wearing people down, not by screaming, by returning to the same point with slightly different language, until the other person became tired enough to accept the framing just to make the conversation stop. That had probably worked in my family for years. It was not going to work on this. Evan contacted me later that evening. He did not describe every word of what had happened in their house. I had no need to know their private marriage line by line, and he seemed to understand that. He told me one thing that mattered. Owen had asked Kendra why, coming later, had anything to do with making beds. Kendra had apparently told him he was too young to understand how family traditions worked. Owen had dropped the subject after that. But not because he was satisfied. Evan said the boy had become watchful. That word stayed with me too. Children do that when a rule stops feeling invisible. They begin checking whether it applies anywhere else. I had already seen it in Lila. Now Owen was doing the same thing from the opposite side. Lila had started examining every expectation for signs that she was being placed below someone else. Owen had started examining every privilege for signs that he had been placed above her. Neither child had created the system. Both were now carrying the work of understanding it. The next call came from Marilyn. My mother had a different style from Kendra, Kendra argued. Marilyn softened. She entered conflict like someone bringing a blanket to a fire, convinced that enough warmth could make people stop noticing what was burning. She said she wanted to talk about what had happened without everyone becoming defensive. I almost laughed at the word everyone. So far, the person who had been expected to absorb most of the discomfort quietly was 9 years old. Marilyn did not defend the chore list. That distinction mattered. She said she had not known Kendra had written it. She had not known Lila was being asked to make multiple beds while the other children were outside. For the first time since the trip, I believed every word she was saying. Then she tried to use that truth as protection. She told me she would never have told Kendra to treat Lila like a servant. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. I could picture her kitchen without being there. Seasonal hand towels, the refrigerator covered in school pictures of all 3 children, the bowl of mints no one wanted. Marilyn loved visible evidence of family birthdays, Christmas stockings, matching pajamas. None of it contradicted what she had said at the rental house. She could love Lila and still believe blood came first. No, I said. You taught her there was a reason Lila should come second. Nothing moved on the other end of the call. For several seconds, I heard only the faint hiss of Marilyn breathing near the receiver. The sentence had not been planned. It came out because it was the cleanest way to separate what my mother had done from what Kendra had done. Marilyn had not written the rule. She had helped make the rule feel permissible. My mother recovered by reaching for evidence of her intentions. She reminded me of birthdays she had attended, school programs, gifts, afternoons when she had watched Lila while I worked. She mentioned the time she had driven across Raleigh in heavy rain because Lila had forgotten a costume piece before a classroom presentation. None of those memories were false. That made the conversation harder, not easier. If Marilyn had never been loving, I could have dismissed her more easily. But prejudice did not need hatred to survive. It could arrive carrying birthday cake, know your favorite color, and still believe someone else had a more natural claim to the word family. I told Marilyn I was not erasing the good things she had done. I was refusing to let them erase the harmful things she believed. She did not like that distinction. I could hear it in the way she began folding phrases around herself. She insisted she had never meant Lila was less valuable. She had grown up hearing that blood relationships carried a different kind of history and had never imagined Kendra would turn those sayings into chores. The explanations might have mattered later. That day, they still sounded like a woman, trying to stand as close to responsibility as possible without stepping inside it. Then Marilyn asked about the following Saturday. Before the vacation, Lila had been scheduled to spend the afternoon at her house with Owen and Ruby. Those grandma afternoons happened every month or two. Marilyn usually ordered pizza, let the children stay up too late if it was an evening visit, and returned Lila to me, carrying some craft project made mostly of glue. A week earlier, I would have treated the plan as automatic. Now nothing involving access felt automatic. Marilyn asked if we could keep the afternoon. She said it might help Lila see that nothing between them had changed. That sentence made me grip the phone tighter. Something had changed. Lila knew what her grandmother believed now. There was no restoring ignorance. I told Marilyn I would ask Lila. My mother started to say she did not want the decision put on a child. I stopped her there. I was not asking Lila to decide whether Marilyn was a good person. I was asking whether she wanted to spend an afternoon alone with someone who had just hurt her. That was her decision. When I found Lila later, she was kneeling beside the chalk course in the backyard, arguing with herself about whether stepping on a crack should add 3 seconds or 5. Her knees were dusted blue. I sat on the back step. I told her Grandma had asked whether she still wanted to come over Saturday. Lila did not need time. Not now. She went back to drawing. There was no triumph in her voice. No attempt to punish Marilyn. She simply did not want to go. I carried that answer back to my mother exactly as Lila gave it. Marilyn did not argue. That surprised me. I expected a plea for 5 minutes on the phone, or a request that I explain how sorry she was. Instead, she became quiet and said she understood. Whether she truly understood or had simply run out of useful defenses, I did not know yet. But Saturday came and went, without Marilyn appearing on our doorstep, without repeated calls, without a gift basket arriving as a substitute for accountability. For the first time since the vacation, my mother respected a boundary before she agreed with it. I noticed. Lila noticed too. She never said so. But when Saturday afternoon passed without interruption, she stopped checking my phone whenever it vibrated. Kendra reacted differently. She apparently decided that if the adults were fighting about the children should stop talking until the adults worked things out. Owen's messages stopped. So did Ruby's. Lila noticed within a day. She did not ask me why at first. She simply opened the family app twice, saw nothing new, and closed it. On the third afternoon, she placed the iPad on the counter beside me. Owen's not answering. I knew enough by then not to speculate. I told her I would find out. Evan confirmed it that evening. Kendra had restricted cousin contact because she thought the messages were making things worse. She said the children needed space from an adult conflict they did not understand. There was an irony there so complete I almost admired it. Kendra had introduced the children to the hierarchy. Now that they were questioning it, she wanted them protected from the conflict. Evan did not agree with using contact as punishment. He was careful when he told me that. He did not ask me to take sides in his marriage. He did not pretend he could override every decision Kendra made, simply because he disagreed. He said only that he did not believe keeping Owen and Ruby away from Lila would teach them anything healthy. I agreed with that much. But I also refused to turn the cousins into a secret communication network. I would not tell Lila to message behind Kendra's back, ask Owen to report what his mother said at home, or turn any of the children into informants in a conflict adults had created. That line mattered. Revenge can become another kind of hierarchy if you are not careful. Adults decide they are justified, children become leverage, and suddenly everyone is using access to make a point. I wanted no part of that. So I told Lila that Kendra had asked the children to pause messaging for a while. Her face hardened. She asked if that meant Owen was mad at her. I told her I had no reason to believe that. She asked whether Ruby was. Same answer. The problem was that reassurance only went so far. Lila had already watched one family rule transform from invisible to obvious. Now silence itself felt like another rule she had not been allowed to vote on. That evening she ate dinner quickly and disappeared into her room. When I checked later, she was lying on her stomach with a book open beside her, though she had been on the same page for at least 20 minutes. I sat near the end of the bed. She did not look at me. She said she hated that adults could decide who kids were allowed to miss. That sentence stayed with me. I could not promise her unlimited access to anyone. Children did not make every decision about relationships. Nor should they. Parents had responsibilities. Safety mattered. Boundaries mattered. But control had to serve the child, not the parent's pride. The next day, Evan called with a suggestion. He waited until the kids were not within earshot. He said that, if the tension settled over the next couple of weeks, he would like to bring Owen and Ruby to meet Lila somewhere neutral. A park, a recreation center, somewhere none of the adults could turn the location into territory. He was not asking for reconciliation with Kendra or a return to unsupervised access. He was asking whether the cousin relationship could exist separately from the argument between the adults. I did not answer him immediately. Part of me wanted to say yes before he finished the thought. Watching Lila miss the children had been painful. Another part of me wanted to build a wall high enough that no one connected to Kendra could reach her again. Both impulses were about me, so I told Evan I would ask Lila. He accepted that without pushing. That evening, I waited until after dinner. Lila was sitting on the living room floor, sorting colored markers into groups that made sense only to her. She had recently developed a theory that some colors were loud and should not be stored beside quiet ones. I sat on the couch. I told her Evan had asked about letting her see Owen and Ruby somewhere away from the houses, with adults nearby. Her hands stopped over a row of markers. For several seconds, she studied the purple one in her fingers. Then she asked whether Kendra would be there. I said no. Grandma? No. She returned the purple marker to the wrong pile, noticed, and moved it back. The questions came more slowly after that. Would she have to apologize to Owen? No. Would Owen have to apologize to her? I told her I was not going to force any of them to say something they did not mean. Would we have to stay if it got weird? No. That seemed to matter most. Lila leaned back on her hands. I watched the choice move across her face in pieces. She was angry with Owen. She missed Owen. She had been hurt in front of him. She also knew he had sent the first apology without being told what words to use. Children can hold contradictions more naturally than adults. We are the ones who keep trying to force feelings into teams. Lila stared down at the markers again. Then she nodded once. I want to see Owen. Her fingers closed around the purple marker. I just don't want anyone deciding I'm the different one again. The meeting with Owen and Ruby happened 3 weeks after we left the Outer Banks. By then, the first shock had worn off enough that ordinary life had started reclaiming pieces of our days. Lila still checked the tone of certain rules before accepting them. She still watched my face when I asked her to help with something she had not chosen. But she had also returned to arguing about bedtime, leaving socks under the coffee table, and treating every board game as a constitutional crisis. That mattered to me more than I said. I did not want the vacation to become the lens through which every hour of her childhood had to be viewed. It had changed something important. It did not deserve to own everything that came after. Evan and I agreed on a public recreation center halfway between our neighborhoods. There was a small cafe near the entrance, a game room, basketball courts, and enough families moving through the building that no adult could turn the place into a private tribunal. I chose a table near the windows, close enough to the exit that leaving would be easy if Lila changed her mind. Before we went inside, I reminded her that she did not have to hug anyone, accept an apology, or stay if she wanted to leave. She was there to see her cousins, not to teach them a lesson. Lila listened, while staring through the windshield at the front doors. Then she asked whether she still got to beat Owen at something. That was the first sign she was ready enough. Evan was already there with the kids. Owen stood beside him with both hands shoved into the pockets of his shorts. Ruby sat on the low concrete wall outside the entrance, swinging her feet and watching people come and go. The moment she saw Lila, she jumped down. Then she stopped herself. A month earlier, Ruby would have run straight at her. Now she looked at Lila first. That tiny pause carried more maturity than any forced apology could have. Lila noticed it too. She gave the smallest nod. Ruby walked over instead of running. The three children stood together in the lobby for several seconds with nothing useful to say. Adults tend to underestimate how physical awkwardness can become for children. Owen stared at the floor. Ruby kept pulling one sleeve over her hand. Lila folded her arms and examined a poster about swimming lessons as if it contained urgent information. Evan and I stayed back. I had no intention of rescuing them from every uncomfortable second. Repair that is completely managed by adults rarely belongs to children when it is finished. Owen spoke first. He did not deliver a speech. He said he was sorry he had kept playing in the pool while Lila was making the beds. Then he added, almost defensively, that he had not thought about it at the time. Lila looked at him. For a moment, I thought she might say it was fine. Children are often taught to protect people from the consequences of apologizing. Someone says sorry, and the expected answer appears automatically. It's okay. But it had not been okay. Lila did not give him that. She said she had been angry watching them swim. Owen nodded once. The silence after that felt different from the first one. Less dangerous. There was now something true sitting between them. We moved into the game room because standing in the lobby had begun to feel like an endurance test. Evan bought bottled water for everyone. I found a table near a stack of old board games with boxes held together by tape. Ruby chose one about building roads and collecting colored cards. Owen objected, because he said she always chose games based entirely on the pictures. Ruby said that was what pictures were for. The disagreement was so familiar that Lila almost smiled. Almost. Before anyone opened the game, Owen returned to the reason we were there. He told Lila that before the trip, he had thought getting first choice sometimes was just something older cousins did. His mother had talked about how he and Ruby had been in the family longer. Since the rules always benefited him, he had never spent much time checking whether they made sense. He did not phrase it that cleanly. He was 11. What he actually did was describe several moments and then get stuck halfway through the explanation. He remembered being allowed to choose rooms first, and hearing Kendra describe Leela as newer. Because no adult challenged the explanation, it had sounded normal to him. The shame appeared more clearly in his body than in his words. His shoulders curled forward. He began peeling the corner of a label from his water bottle. Lila watched him for a while. Then she asked the question he had been avoiding. Older than me? Or more family than me? Owen stopped picking at the label. His face changed. Children have a brutal ability to find the center of a problem without having the vocabulary to decorate it. He had no answer. That was better than a bad one. Ruby, who had been trying unsuccessfully to open the taped board game box, looked up as if she had suddenly remembered something relevant. She said Kendra had once told them that real family gets first turn. The words were so simple that for a second nobody reacted. Then I saw Evan's hand stop halfway toward his water bottle. This was different from the earlier phrasing. Came later. Could still be dressed up as chronology. Real family. Could not. Ruby did not understand why the room had changed. She was 8. She had repeated a sentence she had heard at home, the same way she might have repeated a rule about washing hands before dinner. Her eyes moved from Evan to me, then to Lila. She asked if she had said something bad. Evan answered before I had to. He did not shame her. He told her the problem was not that she had remembered it. The problem was that an adult had taught her a sentence that made one child less real than another. Ruby absorbed that quietly. Then she looked at Lila. The moment could have become painfully sentimental if any of us had pushed it. Nobody did. Ruby simply moved her chair a little closer to Lila's. That was enough. We opened the game. For the next 20 minutes, the children tried to act normal so intensely that nothing about them was normal. Owen became overly polite. Lila let Ruby choose first without arguing. Ruby kept asking whether everyone was okay with every decision. I watched them tiptoe around each other until the tension became almost more uncomfortable than the original silence. Then Owen tried to move one of his pieces farther than the rules allowed. Lila caught him instantly. He claimed he had misunderstood the board. She pointed to the printed instructions. He said the instructions were unclear. Lila stared at him. Oh, now you care about unfair rules? For one terrible second, I thought the entire afternoon might collapse. Then Owen laughed. Not loudly at first. It escaped him in a short, surprised burst. Ruby laughed because Owen was laughing. Lila held out for approximately 3 seconds before she lost the battle too. The sound changed the room. It did not erase anything. That was important. Nothing was suddenly forgiven because children had laughed at a board game. But tension had stopped being the only thing they were allowed to feel. They argued for the rest of the round. Ruby changed alliances twice. Owen accused Lila of deliberately hoarding cards. Lila informed him that planning was not cheating, just because he was bad at it. By the time the game ended, the relationship between them looked less like a problem adults were attempting to repair, and more like 3 children rediscovering how irritating they found one another. I had missed that, not the conflict, the ordinariness. When it came time to choose what to do next, both Owen and Lila reached for the same basketball from a rack near the court entrance. Their hands landed on it at the same time. I felt my body tense before either child spoke. That was how quickly the vacation still reached into me. First pick. Last pick. Who belonged enough to choose? Owen looked at Lila. Then he let go of the ball. For half a second, I thought he was surrendering the choice out of guilt. That would not have been fair either. Instead, he found 3 numbered tokens near the equipment desk and suggested they draw to see who chose the next activity. No grand statement, no apology, just a different rule. Ruby immediately accused him of trying to rig the numbers. Lila inspected the tokens like a casino regulator. I had to turn away so they would not see me smiling. Owen drew first. Lila won anyway. She chose basketball. The game lasted less than 10 minutes because Ruby decided dribbling was optional and Evan refused to count a basket Owen made after clearly stepping out of bounds. Lila celebrated Evan's ruling with such enthusiasm that Owen accused her of bribing the referee. I stayed mostly on the sidelines. That was difficult. Every protective instinct in me wanted to monitor every word, every glance, every small sign that someone might be repeating the hierarchy Kendra had taught. But if I examined every interaction for danger, I would turn Lila into the center of the conflict even when she was trying to move away from it. So I watched enough to keep her safe, and left enough room for her to be 9. When the children went to get water, Evan sat beside me on the bench. He looked older than he had at the vacation house. Not physically older in any dramatic way, just tired around the eyes. He did not ask me to forgive Kendra. He did not explain her. He said hearing Ruby repeat, "real family," had landed differently than hearing about the chore list. I understood. An action can sometimes be defended as a mistake. Language shows the structure underneath. He told me he had started noticing how often certain phrases had passed through his house without being challenged. First choice, our side of the family, Born into it, been here longer. Most of them had never sounded vicious on their own. That was why they had survived. I told him I had done the same thing with Marilyn's language. Bloodline had sounded old-fashioned until it acquired a chore list. We did not turn the conversation into a confession contest. There was enough guilt available without competing over who had missed what first. The useful question was what happened next. Evan said he wanted his children to understand that fairness was not the same thing as everyone receiving identical treatment. Owen was older than Ruby. Ruby needed help with things Owen could do alone. Age, safety, and ability could create different expectations. Blood should not. That distinction mattered to me because it matched what I was trying to rebuild at home with Lila. We ended the meeting after about 2 hours. Long enough for the children to remember they liked one another. Short enough that nobody became exhausted and cruel. At the parking lot, Ruby asked whether they could do it again. Lila looked at me first. I told her she could answer for herself. She said, maybe. Ruby accepted that with surprising grace. Owen made a face and said, maybe, was obviously yes in Lila language. Lila told him his interpretation privileges had been revoked. They parted laughing. The drive home stayed light for almost 15 minutes. Lila replayed every basketball foul Owen had committed and insisted I agree that at least 2 had been intentional. She wanted to know whether Evan's refusal to count the out-of-bounds basket made him officially fair now. I told her fairness was not a certification you earned in one afternoon. She said that sounded inconvenient. Then we reached home, and healing immediately became less tidy. That evening I asked Lila to shower before dinner because she had spent part of the afternoon sliding across a recreation center floor that I strongly suspected had not been cleaned since the previous presidential administration. She wanted to finish a game on the iPad first. I said no. The response came faster than either of us expected. Owen gets more screen time than me. The sentence was sharp enough that I stopped folding the towel in my hands. This was not about adoption. Not directly. It was the new habit underneath the words. Every rule had to be checked against somebody else's life before she could decide whether it was fair. I told her Owen lived in another house, with other parents and other rules. Our rule about showering before dinner existed because she had spent the afternoon sweating in a gym, not because anyone thought she belonged less. Lila crossed her arms. Then she asked whether I would make Owen shower too if he lived here. The question was so determinedly literal that I nearly laughed. I did not. She was not being difficult for entertainment. She was testing whether the explanation stayed intact under pressure. I told her yes. If Owen had spent the afternoon on the same filthy gym floor and lived under my roof, he would be showering too. That satisfied the logic, if not the child. She went upstairs muttering that hypothetical Owen had it rough. 10 minutes later, water started running through the pipes. I sat alone at the kitchen table after she disappeared. The afternoon at the recreation center had been a success. That did not mean the wound was gone. Lila had watched Owen question privilege and had seen Ruby recognize that real family hurt her. Those moments mattered. But one fair afternoon could not undo the instability Kendra had created around the idea of rules. I had to keep doing the boring work. Explain the rule, stay consistent, resist overcorrecting, and keep Lila from becoming responsible for teaching adults how to behave. It was much less satisfying than packing a suitcase and leaving, but it would matter longer. Over the next few days, Owen and Ruby resumed limited contact with Lila. Through arrangements Evan and I kept transparent. Nothing secret. Nothing designed to undermine Kendra. They mostly sent nonsense. A picture of Owen's badly burned toast. Ruby showing off a bracelet. Lila sending back a video of the neighbor's dog barking at a lawn sprinkler as if defending the property from an invading army. The messages were ordinary enough that I found myself checking less often. Then one evening, Lila asked me a question while we were putting away groceries. She was standing inside the open refrigerator, deciding where a carton of berries should go, although we both knew there was only one empty shelf. She had been unusually quiet since the recreation center meeting. I assumed she was tired. Instead, she shut the refrigerator and leaned against the door. If Owen gets it now, why can't Grandma? I put the grocery bag down. There it was, the next layer. Up to that point, I had thought the repair between the children would give Lila relief. In some ways it had. It had also sharpened the contrast. Owen was 11. He had listened to something unfair, benefited from it, and still managed to ask whether it made sense. Marilyn was 65. She had spent years speaking the language Kendra had used to build the rule. Lila was no longer asking whether Grandma loved her. She was asking why adulthood had not made Grandma more capable of recognizing harm than a child. I did not have an answer that would make Marilyn look better, so I did not invent one. I told Lila understanding something and being willing to change it were different jobs. She thought about that. Then she put the berries on the only empty shelf and walked away. The next morning, my phone buzzed while I was pouring coffee. A message from Marilyn. For the first time since the vacation, she did not ask to see Lila. She did not ask whether enough time had passed. She did not ask when the family could move on. She asked to meet me alone. The message was short. I think I finally understand what I taught Kendra. Marilyn chose a cafe halfway between her house and mine, somewhere neither of us used often enough for familiarity to soften the conversation before it began. At her kitchen table there would have been the usual mug, school photographs, and little rituals that made conflict easier to fold back into normal. Here there were strangers with laptops, paper cups, and nothing for my mother to arrange. She was already seated when I arrived, both hands around coffee she had not touched. 4 weeks had not changed her face, but for once she was not trying to make continuity look like proof that everything would eventually be fine. I sat down across from her. Marilyn did not ask when she could see Lila, or whether enough time had passed. She went straight to the phrase she had used at the vacation house. Blood family comes first, and admitted she could finally hear it, without the gentle meaning she had always assigned to herself. Marilyn explained that she had grown up in a family where bloodline language was so ordinary that no one would have thought to call it a hierarchy. Her parents talked about the family name, firstborn responsibility, resemblance, and who would carry the family forward. There had been no explicit declaration that biological relatives were worth more. Blood had simply been treated as a natural kind of authority. She had carried that language into adulthood. When Kendra was born, relatives celebrated whose eyes and chin she had. The same habits returned with Owen and Ruby, and Marilyn admitted she had repeated phrases about our side, children born into traditions, and the Bennett look without considering how they sounded once Lila joined us. What she had treated as heritage, Kendra had learned to use as rank. Marilyn was careful about one distinction. She had never told Kendra to give Lila fewer choices, or put only her name on a chore list. I believed her. It explained the chain without excusing what either of them had done. She looked down at her coffee and said, I never told her to treat Lila like a servant. The line had weight because it was true. I let the silence sit before answering. You taught her there was a reason Lila should come second. Marilyn's fingers tightened around the paper cup. A blender started near the counter. The cafe door opened on a burst of August heat, and she stared at the cardboard sleeve until she finally nodded. For once, she did not reach for intention as a defense. She also recognized something about Kendra that had always been there. My sister liked order, kept score, and noticed who received which advantage. Those traits had not made her cruel. But Marilyn's bloodline language had given them a moral explanation. Marilyn had handed her the language. Kendra had chosen to build rules from it. The useful question now was whether understanding that chain would change anyone's behavior. Marilyn asked what an apology to Lila should look like. I told her it had to name what she had done rather than apologize for Lila's feelings, and it could not become a request for comfort, a large gift, or a shortcut back to access. Marilyn's face tightened at that last part. She had always understood apology as a bridge back toward normal. This one might end at a boundary Lila was not ready to open. She asked whether I thought Lila would see her. I told her I did not know. For once, I did not add anything to soften the answer. When I got home, Lila was on the living room floor, trying to build a tower out of playing cards. The dog next door was barking through the fence, and she had started muttering that he was doing it on purpose whenever the cards collapsed. I sat on the floor beside her. She gave me a suspicious look, because sitting on the floor beside a 9-year-old building cards is the universal signal that a parent has something to say. I told her Grandma had asked whether she could apologize. Lila placed another card carefully against the side of the tower. She asked whether Marilyn was coming over. I said no. The next card slid sideways. Lila caught it before the structure fell. I told her Grandma would only see her if she wanted that, and there was no deadline. The tower held for another 10 seconds. Then Lila pulled one card from the middle, and the entire thing collapsed. She watched the cards scatter. Not yet. 2 words. No explanation. I nodded. We started gathering the cards. That was the whole conversation. I did not ask what would make her ready. I did not ask whether "not yet" meant next week or next month. Children already spend so much of their lives explaining decisions to adults. This one belonged to her. I sent Marilyn the answer exactly as I had received it. She did not call, ask me to relay how sorry she was, or send flowers, candy, money, or one of the elaborate craft kits she usually bought when she wanted to repair a mood. Days passed, then a week. The absence of pressure became its own action. Lila noticed. I knew because the first Saturday Marilyn usually would have called. Lila glanced at my phone once when it buzzed, saw it was a grocery notification, and went back to coloring without asking who it was. A month earlier, Marilyn would have believed love meant showing up. Now restraint was the most loving thing she could offer. Kendra was moving in the opposite direction. I knew only what Evan told me. By that point, I had become careful about the boundary between their marriage and my conflict with Kendra. I did not want nightly reports or private details about what they said after the kids went to bed. What mattered was anything affecting Lila or the cousins. Near the end of the 5th week after the vacation, Evan called while I was washing dishes. He told me that he and Kendra had scheduled counseling. He said it without drama. No threat of divorce. No ultimatum delivered for my approval. He had reached a point where he no longer believed they were arguing about one mistake at a rental house. They were arguing about what values they were teaching Owen and Ruby. He did not tell me what happened in the first session. I did not ask. That privacy mattered. If counseling was going to be real, it could not become another source of information for me to use against Kendra. What Evan did tell me was that Kendra had initially treated the appointment like a punishment. She believed he was escalating a family disagreement into a problem with their marriage. Evan saw it differently. He said he had spent years leaving Kendra in charge of anything he considered her side of the family. He had told himself that staying out of it was respect. Now he understood that parenting did not have separate departments. If his children were being taught who deserved more based on blood, he was already involved whether he wanted to be or not. I leaned against the sink while he spoke, watching soap bubbles collapse around a plate. That was the strange thing about this entire situation. Almost nobody had been doing what they believed was wrong. Marilyn believed she was honoring family. Evan believed he was avoiding unnecessary interference. Even Kendra believed, at least at first, that she was protecting the place her children had always occupied. Intentions had surrounded Lila on every side. She had still ended up making their beds. That was why I had stopped using intention as the primary test. Behavior was easier to trust. The first meaningful proof from Marilyn had been accepting "not yet." The first meaningful proof from Evan was seeking help without demanding I reward him for it. Kendra had not reached that point. Not yet. A few days later, Evan called again. He sounded exhausted, not angry. Exhausted in the way people sound when they have had the same argument enough times that even winning it would no longer feel satisfying. He told me about something Owen had said. The conversation had happened in their house. I was not there. I knew only the version Evan chose to share. Kendra had apparently been trying to explain to Owen that there was family history behind the argument that he was too young to fully understand. Bloodline, traditions, generations, adult words wrapped around a very simple event. Owen had listened. Then he had given his mother the kind of answer only a child can give when adults have complicated something past the point of usefulness. I understand making beds. Evan went quiet after repeating it, and so did I. Through the kitchen window, Lila was in the backyard trying to beat her own jump rope record, glaring at the rope each time it caught her shoe and starting again. Owen's answer worked because Kendra's language could not make the event complicated enough to disappear. He was 11, old enough to understand that one child had been working while the others played, even if she insisted he was too young to understand the family history she used to justify it. Adults could hide unfairness inside words like tradition, seniority, legacy, and bloodline. Children kept reducing it to what had actually happened. I watched Lila finally clear the rope 20 times, throw both arms up, then reset, because 21 would obviously be better. Weeks earlier, Kendra had made the list and expected the family to accept the order behind it. Now Marilyn had stopped defending that order. Evan had stopped treating it as somebody else's department, and Owen had begun testing his mother's explanations against what he could see. Kendra was losing something no boundary I set could have taken from her: the right to assume her own children would trust her definition of family. By the 7th week after the vacation, the shape of the conflict had changed enough that I no longer woke up expecting a new message every morning. That did not mean anything had been repaired. It meant the emergency stage had passed. Lila was sleeping normally again. She had stopped checking my face every time I asked her to put something away. Owen and Ruby were back in her life in small, controlled ways, mostly through messages and the occasional neutral meetup. Evan and I arranged without secrecy. Marilyn had honored Lila's "not yet" for several weeks without trying to negotiate around it. Kendra had done less well. What I knew came through direct contact, or what Evan chose to tell me. I did not need access to their marriage in order to understand the broad direction. Counseling had started. Kendra still believed the situation had grown far beyond what the original incident deserved. Evan no longer agreed that the original incident was the right unit of measurement, and somewhere between those two positions, their household had become quieter. Then Marilyn invited us to lunch for her birthday. The invitation arrived as a text, not a phone call. That alone told me she had learned something. She did not assume we were coming, tell me the family needed to move forward, or use the grandchildren being together as leverage. She simply said she was having a small lunch at her house on Sunday. Kendra's family would be there, and Lila was welcome if she wanted to come. If we declined, Marilyn said she would understand. I read the message twice before showing it to Lila. 6 weeks earlier, I would have made the decision myself and called it protection. Now I knew better. Protection still belonged to me. The choice to enter a controlled, safe family space belonged partly to her. I gave Lila the information in practical pieces. It would be at Grandma's house. Kendra would be there. So would Evan, Owen, and Ruby. We would stay only as long as Lila wanted. I would not leave her alone with Kendra. There would be no helping role assigned to her. If anything felt wrong, we would go. Lila sat at the kitchen table turning a spoon in a bowl of yogurt while she listened. She asked whether Grandma knew the rules. I said yes. Then she wanted to know whether Kendra knew them. I told her Marilyn had made the conditions clear. That answer seemed to interest her less than the fact that there was cake. She scraped the last streak of yogurt from the bowl and considered the invitation with the solemnity usually reserved for whether chocolate or vanilla frosting represented a better long-term strategy. Finally, she said she wanted to go. Not for Kendra. Not because she had forgiven Marilyn. She wanted to see Owen and Ruby. And, she admitted after a pause, She wanted to see whether Grandma really acted different when everyone was in the same room. That reason made more sense to me than any sentimental one would have. We agreed on 90 minutes. Not because a stopwatch would be running, but because limits are easier to trust when they have shape. On Sunday morning, Lila changed shirts 3 times. The first was too hot. The second made her look like school. The third had a small embroidered sun near the collar and survived inspection. I did not comment on the extra care. She had been to Marilyn's house dozens of times. That morning she packed herself emotionally as carefully as if we were traveling somewhere unfamiliar. I did the same. The drive across Raleigh took less than half an hour. As we turned onto Maryland Street, Lila became quieter. Houses slipped past in familiar rose-trimmed lawns, mailboxes, crepe myrtles heavy with late summer blooms. Nothing about the neighborhood had changed. That was one of the strangest things about family ruptures. The places remained innocent. Marilyn's front porch still had the same blue ceramic planter. The wind chime still caught the slightest movement of air. The brass numbers beside the door were still crooked because my father had installed them years ago and Marilyn had never admitted she noticed. The house looked exactly like the place Lila had once associated with pizza, craft glue, and being allowed to stay awake too late. She studied it through the windshield. I did not tell her everything would be fine. Instead, I reminded her of our exit plan. She nodded. When we went inside, the first thing I noticed was what did not happen. Marilyn did not rush toward Lila. She did not cry. She did not open her arms and create a social obligation for a child to walk into them. She stood near the dining room, smiled, and let Lila choose the distance between them. Kendra was farther inside the house near the kitchen. Evan stood beside the counter. Owen and Ruby were in the living room. For approximately 5 seconds, every adult behaved as if we were waiting for someone else to decide what kind of afternoon this was going to be. Then Ruby looked around at the silent faces and asked, "Are we allowed to eat now? Or is this still an adult meeting?" The room cracked open. "Not completely, but enough," Owen snorted. Evan looked down to hide a smile. Even Marilyn laughed, softly and a little helplessly. Lila glanced at Ruby and rolled her eyes in the old familiar way. The tension did not disappear, but it stopped pretending it was the only thing in the house. Lunch was simple. Marilyn had made baked chicken, salad, roasted potatoes, and rolls. Nothing elaborate enough to turn the meal into evidence of how much she loved everyone. The birthday cake sat covered on the counter, white frosting visible beneath a clear plastic lid. I noticed something else. There were no assigned seats. In the past, Marilyn often directed everyone automatically. Owen here, Ruby beside him, Lila at the end near the children, adults in the usual places. That day she let people sit. Lila chose the chair beside Ruby. Owen sat across from them. I took a place close enough that Lila could catch my eye without making it obvious. Kendra sat at the other end of the table. She looked composed. Too composed, maybe. Her hair was pinned back. Her napkin was folded precisely across her lap. She participated in the meal without bringing up the vacation, the counseling, or the fact that her sister and niece were sitting in Marilyn's house under conditions she no longer controlled. I did not mistake restraint for change, but I respected the restraint enough not to provoke anything that had not happened. For the first part of lunch, the safest subjects carried us. School starting soon. A new teacher, Owen, was worried about. Ruby's insistence that 3rd grade should not require multiplication because numbers already have enough jobs. Lila described a swim drill she had finally mastered and exaggerated the distance until Owen corrected her. She accused him of jealousy. He told her she had swallowed enough pool water to count as aquatic life. The children did more work repairing the room than any of us adults could have done. That did not mean they were unaware. I saw Lila glance at Marilyn when plates were passed. I saw Owen wait when Kendra reached for the largest roll, as if he was checking whether someone would claim it first. Small rules had become visible to all of them now. That was the cost of exposing a hierarchy. Once children learn that invisible systems exist, they start watching the edges of everything. The test came after the meal. It was so ordinary that 6 weeks earlier none of us would have remembered it. Marilyn stood and began gathering serving dishes. Then she told the children to carry their own plates and cups into the kitchen. All the children. Owen stood first. Ruby stacked her fork on top of her plate. Lila stayed seated for 1 extra second. Her eyes moved to me. I gave no signal. This was not my rule. It did not need my approval to be fair. Lila picked up her plate. Kendra reacted on instinct. She told Owen and Ruby they could leave theirs because she would take them. The words were barely out before Marilyn stopped. She did not raise her voice. She simply said they could carry their own things like everyone else. There was a pause, a very small one, but I watched Kendra's face change. For years, Marilyn's agreement had been built into the structure of the family. Kendra rarely had to ask whether her mother supported the order of things, because the answer arrived before the question. This time it did not. Owen carried his plate away. Ruby followed. Lila was last. She passed Kendra without looking at her, and walked into the kitchen, with her plate balanced carefully in both hands. Nothing dramatic happened. Everyone who had used a plate carried one into the kitchen. Marilyn pointed them toward the counter, and kept moving serving dishes without taking over for any child. When a cloth napkin slipped from her hand, Lila bent before anyone asked, placed it beside the laundry basket, and went back to the living room. My throat tightened at the simplicity of it. She had helped because she chose to, and nobody turned the choice into a role. Kendra noticed too. I knew because she looked from the napkin to Marilyn with a tightness around her mouth that had not been there before. She waited until the children had returned to the living room before speaking. Her tone stayed low enough that the conversation did not become a public confrontation. She accused Marilyn of performing fairness for my benefit. The phrasing told me almost everything I needed to know about where Kendra still was emotionally. To her, equality had become suspicious because it interrupted the old order. Marilyn did not defend herself with a speech. She did not tell Kendra she had changed. She did not tell me she was doing her best. She simply continued clearing the table and said the rule applied to all the children. Then she carried the salad bowl into the kitchen. That was all. I watched Kendra stand beside the dining room table with nothing to argue against except consistency. For the first time, her mother had refused to provide the moral permission beneath her explanation. Kendra could still believe what she believed. She just could not pretend Marilyn's worldview gave her automatic cover anymore. Cake helped. Cake has solved fewer family problems than people pretend, but it remains excellent at making adults stop talking for a while. Marilyn lit 6 candles instead of 65. Because Ruby had apparently informed her that 65 candles constituted a fire hazard. Everyone sang. Lila sang too. Not loudly, but she sang. When Marilyn cut the cake, Owen immediately pointed out one slice that was visibly larger than the others. Lila claimed it before he finished speaking. He objected on the grounds that he had identified it. She argued that observation did not establish ownership. Their exchange escalated into a ridiculous dispute involving surface area, frosting thickness, and whether a decorative sugar flower counted as part of the slice. Ruby solved the problem by taking the piece while they were arguing. Lila stared at the empty space on the tray. Owen stared at Ruby. Ruby took an enormous bite and smiled. For the first time that afternoon, Lila laughed without checking whether anyone else was laughing first. It came out full and sharp. The sound bounced off the dining room walls. Marilyn froze for half a second with the cake server still in her hand. I saw her hear it, not as forgiveness, as something she had almost lost. Lila ended up with another slice. Owen accused Ruby of criminal conduct. Ruby told him to call the cake police. The adults stayed out of it. That was the warmest 10 minutes of the afternoon. Then Kendra decided it was time to leave. There was nothing wrong with leaving. The children had been there long enough. Emotions had remained mostly contained. 90 minutes was approaching. But Kendra's movements had sharpened since the plate incident. She gathered her bag, found Ruby's shoes, and told Owen to get his things. Evan stayed seated. The children noticed before I did. Owen looked at his father. Evan told Kendra he would bring them home later. He did not say it privately in another room. He did not make me reconstruct the scene afterward. I was standing near the living room doorway when it happened. His tone was calm. That mattered. He was not trying to embarrass her. He was making a parental decision openly. Kendra's eyes moved toward me, then Marilyn, then back to Evan. For a second, I expected the afternoon to rupture after all. Instead, she tightened the strap of her bag over her shoulder and left alone. The front door closed without being slammed. The wind chime outside trembled from the movement. Nobody spoke immediately. Evan rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. Marilyn began collecting abandoned wrapping paper near the birthday gifts. Even though there was very little to collect, Lila looked toward the front door. I waited for her to ask what had happened. She did not. She looked at Owen instead. "Your mom's mad." Owen shrugged with the impressive dishonesty of a child who obviously knew his mother was mad, but had no intention of processing it in front of an audience. Then he asked whether there was more cake. That was where the children left the problem. I envied them. We stayed another 20 minutes. Long enough for the kids to move into the backyard with a foam ball. Long enough for Marilyn to sit down, instead of cleaning something. Long enough for the house to stop feeling like it might break every time someone touched a rule. Lila did not cling to Marilyn. She did not ask for another grandma afternoon. But when Marilyn offered everyone cold water before they left, Lila took the cup directly from her hand. Their fingers touched. Neither made anything of it. Repair sometimes moves at the speed of ordinary gestures. On the drive home, Lila talked more than she had on the way there. Most of it was about dessert injustice. She argued that Ruby had exploited a legal loophole in the cake dispute and therefore should be disqualified from future first choice. I asked whether banning someone from first choice for abusing first choice might create a philosophical problem. Lila told me not to make it weird. I accepted the correction. Then she became quiet for a few minutes. I wondered whether she was thinking about Kendra leaving. Instead, she asked if Grandma had really meant it when she made everyone carry their own plate. I said I could not know what Marilyn felt inside. I could only tell Lila what I had seen. Grandma had made one rule. She had applied it to everyone. And when Kendra challenged it, Grandma had not changed the rule. Lila looked out the window. That was better. Not good. Not fixed. Better. I held on to the distinction. Later that evening, after we were home and Lila had disappeared upstairs to shower, Evan sent me a message asking whether he could call. I stepped onto the back porch. Cicadas screamed from the trees. The concrete still held the day's heat. Through the kitchen window, I could see Lila's water glass beside the sink, exactly where she had left it. Evan did not give me a report on whatever happened after Kendra returned home. He did not tell me what they said in counseling. He only acknowledged what had happened in front of us. He had seen Kendra react when Marilyn applied the same rule to all the kids. He had seen Owen and Ruby notice, and he had seen how quickly the children relaxed once they stopped wondering whether every ordinary choice carried a hidden ranking underneath it. His voice sounded tired again. But beneath the exhaustion was something harder than before. Clarity. "This isn't about one vacation anymore," he said. "It's about what we're teaching them every day." By the second month after the vacation, Kendra had stopped trying to convince me that nothing serious had happened. She had not accepted my version of it either. Instead, she changed tactics. According to Evan, Kendra now argued that the cousins needed distance because the adults had created too much tension around them. She framed the restriction as protection from an adult conflict they were too young to carry. I agreed with the principle. I had refused from the beginning to use children as messengers or witnesses against their parents. What I did not accept was Kendra's definition of conflict. Owen questioning an unfair rule, Ruby learning why real family hurt Lila, and the cousins wanting to remain close without the old hierarchy were not dangers to the children. They were dangers to the certainty Kendra had once expected from them. Evan did not agree. He made that clear to me without asking me to referee their marriage. He and Kendra were still attending counseling. He was Lila's uncle by marriage, and the legal father of Owen and Ruby, which meant he had as much responsibility for their social relationships as Kendra did. If he believed keeping them away from Lila was being used as punishment for questioning their mother, he was not going to pretend it was simply a neutral parenting decision. I told him the same thing I had told myself from the beginning. I would not use Lila to win an argument with Kendra. If Owen and Ruby saw her, it would be because Lila wanted to see them, not because their presence proved me right. That distinction became important sooner than I expected. One evening, Lila came into the kitchen while I was cutting peaches and asked whether Evan and Kendra were fighting because of her. She tried to make the question sound casual. Her eyes stayed on the cutting board instead of my face. A thin curl of peach skin clung to the knife. I set it down. In the weeks since the beach house, I had become more careful about separating what children caused from what adults chose. Lila had not written the chore list, taught Owen and Ruby anything about bloodline, or asked Evan to challenge his wife. Her treatment had exposed choices the adults had already made. I told her that Kendra and Evan were responsible for how they handled their marriage and how they raised their children. The disagreement had begun because adults made decisions. It did not belong on her shoulders simply because she had been the child those decisions affected. Lila picked up a peach slice. She chewed it slowly. Then she asked whether things would be easier if she stopped seeing Owen and Ruby. That question hurt more. Not because it surprised me, because I understood exactly where it came from. Children often discover sacrifice before they discover boundaries. If someone they love is uncomfortable, the instinct is to remove themselves from the equation. Less noise, less trouble, less reason for adults to fight. I told her she did not need to disappear to make other people's lives easier. She could choose whether she wanted Owen and Ruby in her life, based on what the relationship felt like to her, not based on whether Kendra preferred silence. Lila took another peach slice and considered that. Then she said she still wanted them. The answer came without drama. I believed it because of that. A few days later, school gave me my first glimpse of how much of Lila's own voice had survived underneath everything else. Her class had an open house afternoon before the start of the new term. Parents wandered through the building while teachers displayed projects from a summer enrichment program. Lila had made a poster about coastal ecosystems after becoming briefly obsessed with ghost crabs during our trip to the Outer Banks, a piece of irony neither of us mentioned. Her display had hand-drawn dunes, sea oats, little arrows pointing toward crabs, and one pelican that looked alarmingly muscular. I stood near the back while she explained part of it to another girl from her class. The girl's mother was beside me, and the conversation was ordinary enough that I only caught pieces until the girl asked whether I was Lila's real mom. There was no cruelty in it, only clumsy vocabulary. Before I could step in, Lila pointed toward me with the capped end of a marker. Caroline is my real mom. Adoption is how we became family. Then she went back to ghost crabs. What stayed with me was how little the question owned the moment. Afterward, Lila cared far more that I had photographed her worst explaining face. I told her explaining faces were legally protected from criticism. She informed me I had invented that, and by the time we reached the car, she was still complaining about the picture. That same week, Lila brought home the schedule for a small summer swim meet at the community pool where she had been taking lessons. It was not an elite competition. There were no scouts, medals worth displaying for decades, or dramatic stakes. Children raced other children while parents sat under umbrellas and shouted lane numbers nobody could hear over the water. Lila had been practicing a 50-meter freestyle and a short relay. She left the schedule on the counter beside my keys, circled her races in blue marker, and spent the rest of dinner pretending she had not done that intentionally. I waited. Eventually she asked whether Owen and Ruby could come, not Kendra. The distinction was immediate. I did not challenge it. I asked whether she wanted Evan there too, since the children would need a parent. She said that was fine. Then she added that Ruby was not allowed to make a sign because Ruby's signs were embarrassing. This made me suspect there had already been discussion of a sign. Evan confirmed it the next day. Kendra did not like the arrangement. He did not tell me the full argument, and I did not ask. He simply said that he and Kendra had not agreed on limiting every cousin interaction. He would bring Owen and Ruby to the swim meet because he believed that relationship remained healthy and because Lila had specifically invited them. There was no secrecy, no sneaking the children out of the house. Kendra knew where they were going. That mattered. I would not have participated otherwise. The Saturday of the meet arrived hot enough to make the metal bleachers uncomfortable by 9 in the morning. The community pool smelled of chlorine, sunscreen, and the sweet artificial fruit of sports drinks. Children in swim caps moved through the crowd in packs, dripping onto concrete. Parents clustered beneath umbrellas, carrying folding chairs, coolers, towels, and enough equipment to suggest we were preparing for a week-long expedition rather than several 30-second races. Lila was already nervous before Evan arrived. She denied this while checking her goggles 7 times. The 8th time, she claimed the strap had changed shape. I told her goggles were not known for emotional instability. She told me I was not taking equipment safety seriously. Then Ruby appeared. I saw the sign before I saw her face. It was made from bright poster board and held above her head with both hands. Glitter had been used without adult restraint. Across the center, in letters large enough to be seen from another county, Ruby had written, "Go Lila, swim fastest." The second est had been squeezed upward after she ran out of space. Lila closed her eyes. Owen came behind Ruby, carrying 2 bottles of water and wearing the expression of someone who had already spent a car ride, listening to criticism of the sign. Evan looked tired but amused. Ruby lowered the poster and waited for Lila's reaction. Lila opened her eyes again. "You spelled it wrong." Ruby looked offended. "I made it stronger." That was the end of the complaint. Lila laughed. Not politely, not carefully. She took the sign long enough to inspect the glitter, then handed it back before any transferred to her swimsuit. The race announcement started before the children could argue further. For the next half hour, family conflict disappeared beneath whistles, lane assignments, and the slap of bare feet against wet concrete. That was the greatest relief of the morning. Nobody was healing on purpose. Nobody was proving a point. Lila was trying to remember when to breathe during freestyle. Owen was trying to calculate whether lane 4 had an advantage because of the way the sun hit the water. Ruby was eating pretzels and dropping salt all over Evan's chair. I sat beneath an umbrella and watched them be children. When Lila's first race was called, she moved toward the starting blocks with the stiff, concentrated posture she used when she was trying not to look nervous. Owen leaned forward. Ruby lifted the sign. The starter sounded. Lila Dove. Her entry was not perfect. One arm hit slightly ahead of the other, and she surfaced behind 2 swimmers. For several seconds, all I could see was a blue cap and splashes. Then Owen started shouting. He had apparently decided encouragement required volume rather than content. "Go, Lila, kick, kick, kick." Every child in the pool was already kicking. That did not stop him. Ruby joined in, yelling, "Fastest," as if she had successfully introduced a new athletic category. I covered my mouth. Lila reached the wall 3rd, not 1st, not last. 3rd. She grabbed the edge, pulled off her goggles, and turned toward the bleachers. Owen was still yelling. Ruby was shaking the sign hard enough to shed glitter into Evan's hair. Lila's face went red. For half a second, she looked genuinely horrified by the existence of relatives. Then she laughed. I saw it from across the pool. Her whole expression changed. She laughed so hard, she nearly missed the official telling swimmers to clear the lane. That moment mattered more to me than her place in the race. At the beach house, Lila had looked toward a pool and wondered why everybody else was allowed to be a child while she was inside making beds. 2 months later, she was in the water. Her cousins were the ones making fools of themselves for her. No rule had put her there. No adult had granted her a privilege. She had simply been invited to swim, and they had come to cheer. Her relay team placed second later that morning. Owen claimed the result should be appealed because another team had suspiciously coordinated turns. Lila told him he had watched too many sports documentaries. Ruby ate the last orange slice from Lila's snack container and then argued that race participants should not be burdened by citrus management. By noon, all 3 children were hungry, damp, sun-reddened around the shoulders despite sunscreen, and arguing about where to eat. We ended up at a casual sandwich place nearby. There was no assigned seating, no first pick, no special rule. Ruby sat beside Lila because she wanted to show her a game on her tablet. Owen took the chair across from them and stole one of Lila's fries without permission. She slapped his wrist. He stole another. She threatened consequences that sounded increasingly creative and physically impossible. For 20 minutes, nobody mentioned adoption. Nobody mentioned Kendra. Nobody mentioned Marilyn. That absence was not avoidance. It was freedom. I had spent so much time worrying that protecting Lila might isolate her that I had almost forgotten what healthy connection looked like when no adult was managing it. It was noisy, imperfect, occasionally annoying. No one was grateful. No one was performing. They simply belonged in the same space because they wanted to be there. When Evan dropped us back at the pool parking lot where my car was waiting, he did not turn the day into a report. He only said the children had needed it. I agreed. Lila slept for most of the drive home, damp hair drying against the seat belt, Ruby's glitter still clinging to one shoulder. I left it there. The next day, Kendra called me. I had expected anger. Instead, her voice was controlled in a way that suggested she had already spent time deciding what not to say. She told me Owen and Ruby had talked about the swim meet all evening. Ruby had apparently recreated Lila's race using bath toys. Owen had complained that the officials were inconsistent. Kendra repeated those details with a strange flatness. Then she told me something else. Owen had said he did not want first choice anymore, if first choice meant another kid had to be placed behind him just because of when they entered the family. Kendra did not paraphrase it comfortably. I could hear resistance in the way she spoke around the idea, but she could no longer blame me for putting it into his head. I had not been in her house when he said it. I had not prompted him. At the recreation center, he had started questioning the rule himself. At Marilyn's birthday, he had watched everyone carry the same responsibility. At Lila's swim meet, there had been no hierarchy to defend. The children were building their own comparison now. Kendra had wanted biology to create loyalty. Instead, her children were separating loyalty to their mother from agreement with her. That was harder to control. She told me counseling had forced her to look at things she still believed had been exaggerated. I did not ask what happened in those sessions. She said Evan had stopped accepting tradition as an explanation. Owen was watching every family preference for signs that somebody had been ranked. Ruby had started saying take turns whenever Kendra tried to decide who chose first. There was almost irritation in Kendra's voice when she mentioned that. I pictured Ruby applying fairness to cereal bowls, television remotes, and car seats with the relentless enthusiasm only an 8-year-old could sustain. A small part of me wanted to smile. I did not. Kendra was finally calling me without trying to make me defend my reaction. That deserved attention, not absolution. She spoke for another minute, then stopped. The pause on the line felt different from all the others we had shared. At the rental house, Kendra had possessed certainty. At the rental house, Kendra had sounded certain about where Lila belonged, what privileges meant, and why my reaction was excessive. Now, the certainty had been worn down by questions she could not dismiss as mine. Her husband, her mother, her own children. Finally, she asked the first question since the vacation that did not contain an argument inside it. What would I actually have to change? I looked through the kitchen window. Lila's wet swimsuit hung over the patio chair to dry. Beside it, Ruby's glitter sign leaned against the wall, because Lila had insisted on bringing it home, despite calling it humiliating for most of the morning. I could have given Kendra a list. Do this. Stop saying that. Apologize exactly this way. Wait this many weeks. A list would have been easy. It also would have given her another set of rules to perform. I told her there was no single conversation that could make me trust her with Lila again. There was no perfect apology that would reset access. If she wanted anything to change between us, we would have to see different behavior consistently enough that the difference stopped looking temporary. She did not like the lack of certainty. I could hear it. Kendra had always preferred measurable things. Schedules, turns, order, rules. I was giving her time, and time could not be managed as easily. She asked whether that meant I would never trust her again. I did not answer the question she wanted. I told her trust was not something she could negotiate in advance. It would have to become the consequence of what she did next. After the call ended, I stood in the kitchen for a while with my hand resting on the counter. 2 months earlier, Kendra had believed the most important thing she could give her children was priority. First room, first choice, first claim. She had called it protection. Now Owen and Ruby were beginning to refuse the very thing she had tried to preserve for them. And for the first time since the vacation, Kendra was no longer asking how to prove she had been right. She was asking what she would have to become if she wanted any of us to believe she could be different. By the 3rd month after the vacation, nobody was pretending the problem would disappear on its own. Lila still chose when and how she saw Owen and Ruby. Marilyn was earning trust through consistent behavior, and Kendra remained in counseling with Evan without pushing against every boundary I set. Her question at the end of our last call, what would I actually have to change, had been a step forward. But she was still more comfortable discussing changed behavior than naming the belief that had made the behavior seem reasonable. Until she could do that, the old hierarchy still had an escape route back into the family. So when Evan suggested that the 4 adults meet somewhere neutral, I agreed. We met without the children in a conference room attached to a community counseling center in Raleigh. 6 chairs, beige walls, a box of tissues, and a parking lot view made it almost aggressively ordinary. No family home, no birthday table, nothing Marilyn or Kendra could organize into familiar roles. We arrived separately. I sat near the end of the table rather than across from Kendra, because I did not want the geometry of the room to turn the meeting into a trial. Evan sat beside her. Marilyn sat across from me. For the first few minutes, nobody spoke about the vacation directly. I had learned enough by then to recognize another family reflex. When an important conversation became unavoidable, we sometimes approached it sideways until everyone was tired before reaching the center. I did not let that happen. I told them I had not come to decide whether we could all go back to normal. Normal had been part of the problem. I had come because if there was going to be any family structure left after this, I needed clarity about what everyone believed and what would happen going forward. Before anyone started explaining themselves, I made one thing explicit. None of the children would carry responsibility for what happened next. Owen's questions, Ruby's repetition of what she had been taught, and Lila's refusal of access or forgiveness all belonged outside the blame in that room. Kendra began by calling the vacation bad judgment and admitting she should never have put only Lila's name on the list. That described the event, not the belief beneath it, so I asked why the list had made sense to her when she wrote it. She looked toward Evan, but he did not supply softer language for her. Nobody did. She tried seniority once more. I pointed out the contradiction she had never been able to resolve. Owen was older than Lila, Ruby was younger, yet both had been placed ahead of her. Age could not consistently produce that order. Time in the extended family could, but only because Kendra had chosen blood as the measure of who arrived first. Her fingers stopped straightening the edge of a paper napkin. Then she admitted what she had spent 3 months describing around. She had believed biological children should have precedence in family traditions, first choices, and certain privileges. She said she had feared that making room for Lila would erase distinctions she considered real and somehow reduce Owen and Ruby's place. She had called what she was doing protection. Hearing it plainly brought no satisfaction. The belief was finally named, and it led straight back to the chore list. Evan pointed out that Owen and Ruby had lost nothing essential as the special privileges disappeared. They were still loved and secure. They had simply stopped needing someone else to be last. Their relationship with Lila had improved, rather than weakened. Kendra did not contradict him. She rubbed one thumb over the side of her index finger, the same nervous habit she had carried since we were teenagers. Marilyn did not retreat from what she had already admitted to me weeks earlier. In front of Kendra, she took responsibility for normalizing bloodline as a measure of family without pretending that made Kendra's adult choices hers to absorb. She had supplied moral permission. Kendra had chosen to turn it into rules. Evan had ignored a part of family life he thought was not his territory, and I had trusted exposure to fix beliefs I had never challenged. The failures were different, and none canceled the others. When the conversation turned toward the future, I set the boundaries in plain language, rather than handing Kendra a checklist she could complete. She would not have unsupervised access to Lila, and I gave no date when that might change. There would be no joint family vacations in the near future. If Lila ever attended Kendra's home or an event she hosted, ordinary house and safety rules could apply. Rules that singled Lila out because she was adopted or had come later could not. The cousin relationship would continue as long as Lila wanted it, and it remained healthy. Marilyn's access would move at Lila's pace as well. A short visit could stay short, and a no would remain no. Nobody argued immediately. Kendra looked unhappy. That was not the same thing as the boundaries being unfair. She asked whether she would ever be allowed to be alone with Lila again. I told her I did not know. The truth had become easier to say over the previous 3 months. Trust had no calendar. Evan remained quiet until I finished, then said he and Kendra would continue counseling. He did not threaten divorce or pretend their marriage was over. What had changed was his assumption that years together meant their parenting values were aligned. He needed time to see whether Kendra's changes belonged to her or only to the pressure around her. Kendra lowered her eyes. I could restrict access to my daughter, and Marilyn could withdraw her old approval, but Evan shared a home, 2 children, and a future with Kendra. His loss of trust was a consequence I had neither designed nor controlled. We did not end the meeting with hugs. Nobody suggested dinner. There was no group promise to start over. Kendra said she understood the boundaries, even if she did not like all of them. Marilyn asked whether there was anything else she needed to know. There was not. Evan walked out with Kendra. My mother stayed behind long enough to throw away her coffee cup. She paused beside me before leaving. Months earlier, she would have touched my shoulder and asked whether we were okay. This time she did not demand a status report on our relationship. She simply left. Another small behavior. Another thing I noticed. The drive home was quiet. I had expected to feel lighter. Instead, I felt emptied out. For 3 months, so much of my attention had been aimed forward toward that conversation. Not consciously every day, but enough that finally reaching it created a strange absence. Kendra had admitted what she believed. The boundaries had been said aloud. Nothing outside my windshield looked different. Traffic still slowed near an intersection under construction. A man in the next lane drummed his fingers against his steering wheel. Afternoon sun flashed off windshields. Family history had changed shape in a beige conference room, and Raleigh had not noticed. Lila was at home with a babysitter I trusted, sprawled on the living room rug by the time I returned. She was drawing what appeared to be a shark wearing roller skates. The image was bad enough that I stared at it for several seconds before she informed me I was looking at it upside down. Turning the paper did not help. I sat on the couch. I had decided before the meeting that Lila deserved an age-appropriate version of what happened, not every adult detail. I gave Lila the version she needed. Kendra had admitted believing biological children should come first in some family situations. Grandma had admitted helping teach that idea. And Evan and Kendra were still working on how they wanted to raise Owen and Ruby. For Lila, nothing about the boundaries had changed. No vacation or time alone with Kendra. No adoption-based rules. Continued contact with Owen and Ruby if she wanted it. And grandma visits at her own pace. Lila listened with the marker resting against her lower lip. She did not ask what Kendra had said about her. That surprised me. Instead, she asked whether Kendra was sorry. I told her I believed Kendra finally understood more of what she had done, but understanding and repair were not the same thing. Lila nodded as if this matched something she had already decided. Then she looked at the shark drawing again. Does that mean I have to forgive her now? I told Lila no. An apology did not purchase its way back into her life. She could forgive someday, and still keep boundaries, take a long time, or decide the relationship never became close again. She did not have to decide any of that now. Lila capped the marker. She seemed satisfied with that. Then she told me the shark was supposed to be fast because roller skates were obviously faster than fins on land, and our conversation moved somewhere else. I let it. That night, after Lila was asleep, I walked through the house turning off lights. Her swim bag hung by the back door, and Ruby's glitter sign was still propped beside her bookshelf despite Lila's insistence that it embarrassed her. Ordinary life was accumulating around the worst morning we had shared, instead of letting that morning define everything after it. My calendar already held school, swim practice, a cousin outing, and a tentative afternoon with Marilyn. None of it guaranteed change. Boundaries were easy to announce in a quiet room where everyone knew they were being watched. The real test would come during ordinary visits, tired afternoons, and moments when old habits could return without an audience. I had said what the rules were. Now I had to see who could live by them. 6 months after the morning, I found Lila making beds while her cousins played in the pool. The first thing I noticed was how rarely adoption entered our kitchen anymore. Not because we had stopped talking about it. Adoption was still part of Lila's life, just as Raleigh was part of where she lived, and swimming was part of what she loved. We still answered questions when they came. We still kept the language open and ordinary. What disappeared was the suspicion. One Saturday morning in January, I found Lila standing in front of the open dishwasher, with her hair sticking up on one side and a piece of toast clenched between her teeth. She had been assigned to unload the silverware while I wiped down the counters. 6 months earlier, she might have watched my face before touching the basket. She might have asked whether Owen had chores that morning. She might have searched the request for something hidden underneath it. That day she simply complained that spoons were unfair because there were always too many of them. Then she began sorting them. I leaned against the counter with my coffee and watched her drop forks into the wrong section twice because she was trying to eat breakfast at the same time. It was so ordinary that I almost missed what it meant. The vacation had not disappeared from our family history. It had simply stopped governing our house. Our rules had become boring again. I had never understood what a gift boring could be until Lila lost it. Lila still had chores, and when Owen and Ruby visited, they followed the ordinary rules of our house. The rules were not identical. An 11-year-old could do things, an 8-year-old could not, and swim practice gave Lila responsibilities the others did not have, but none of the explanations began with blood. The cousins saw one another every few weeks at my house, neutral activities with Evan and occasionally Marilyn's. The solemn meetings were gone. Owen accused Lila of changing game rules when she was losing. Lila accused him of creative interpretation when he was winning. Ruby usually agreed with both until their argument created an advantage for her. They had gone back to behaving like cousins. For a while, I had worried that every gathering would become another test. But eventually I stopped looking for grand proof and watched for patterns instead. Marilyn provided them. Visits began short, and with me present. She did not turn them into apology sessions or use gifts to force warmth. If Lila declined a weekend, Marilyn accepted it. When all 3 children were there, ordinary responsibilities followed what they did rather than who they were. By December, Lila could spend 2 hours at Marilyn's house and use the drive home to complain about a game, a snack, or something Owen had done instead of revisiting the old conflict. I kept my eyes on the road and let the ordinariness speak for itself. Kendra's consequences lasted longer. She still had no unsupervised access to Lila, no automatic invitation to every school or swim event, and no return to family vacations. She had also lost the role of deciding extended family arrangements by default. Marilyn handled her home, Evan handled his responsibilities with the children, and I handled Lila's. Owen and Ruby had not turned against their mother. They still loved and depended on her, but they no longer treated blood privilege as a rule they had to inherit. Owen questioned arbitrary first choices, while Ruby had become so committed to taking turns that Evan once told me she tried to rotate who chose breakfast cereal first. The image of Kendra facing a moral framework for cereal amused me more than it should have. Counseling continued, and Evan and Kendra were still together, without pretending their parenting trust had magically returned. Kendra, meanwhile, had stopped acting as if the passage of time entitled her to access to Lila. Then, in January, she asked whether Lila would ever be willing to hear an apology face-to-face. She did not ask for an outing or for my trust back, and I did not answer for my daughter. I waited until that evening. Lila was at the kitchen table doing math homework, with the expression of someone who had been personally betrayed by fractions. One problem had been erased so many times that the paper was thinning. I told her Kendra had asked whether she would be willing to speak with her sometime. Lila did not react immediately. She kept staring at the fraction. Then she asked whether Kendra would be at Grandma's house the following Sunday. I said yes. Marilyn had already invited everyone for an early dinner. Lila erased the same number again. She asked if Owen and Ruby would be there. Yes. She thought for another moment. Then she said Kendra could talk to her there, as long as I stayed nearby inside an ordinary family visit, without a private meeting, an emotional ambush, or a special trip built around forgiveness. The exit would remain available. Sunday came cold and bright. Marilyn's trees were bare, and the blue ceramic planter on her porch held nothing but dark soil. Inside, the house smelled like roast chicken and rosemary. 6 months earlier, arriving at that house had felt like entering a controlled test. This time, Lila ran ahead of me, because Owen had already texted that he was setting up a game, and she believed he was deliberately choosing the pieces before she arrived. She barely remembered to take off her coat. Ruby met her in the hallway wearing 2 different socks and immediately began explaining that the mismatch was intentional. For the first half hour, nothing important happened. I was grateful. Marilyn moved between the kitchen and dining room. Evan helped bring food out. Kendra stayed mostly out of Lila's path without making the distance conspicuous. I watched her once from across the room. She looked different from the woman at the Outer Banks house. Not transformed, not humbled into another personality. Still Kendra, still neat, still controlled. Still, the person who straightened a serving spoon after someone left it crooked beside a dish. But she no longer moved through the room, as if every choice belonged to her. When Ruby reached for the largest dinner roll, Kendra did not intervene. Owen took it first. Ruby protested. Lila suggested splitting it. Owen refused. Ruby stole half when he looked away. The problem resolved itself exactly as family problems involving bread have resolved themselves for generations. No adult turned it into a lesson. After dinner, while Owen and Ruby carried dishes into the kitchen, Lila came to stand beside me. She did not say she was ready. She just looked toward Kendra. That was enough. I stayed in the living room. Kendra sat in an armchair across from Lila, rather than beside her. The distance mattered. Marilyn stayed in the kitchen. Evan took Owen and Ruby toward the back room under the transparent fiction that they needed help choosing another game. No audience. No stage. I was close enough for Lila to look at me if she wanted. She did not. Kendra kept her hands folded in her lap. For months, I had wondered what an apology from her would sound like once she stopped defending herself. In the end, it was much shorter than I expected. She told Lila she had treated being biologically related as a reason Owen and Ruby should come before her. She admitted that putting only Lila's name on the chore list had not been about teaching responsibility. It had been the result of a belief that Lila was entitled to less. Then she named the part that mattered beyond the beach house. She said she had taught Owen and Ruby that the difference was normal. Kendra did not explain where she had learned the belief, invoke Marilyn, list her months of counseling, insist she had always loved Lila, or ask whether the apology was enough. When she finished, the room became quiet. I could hear cabinet doors closing in the kitchen. Somewhere down the hall, Ruby laughed at something Owen said. Lila studied Kendra with the same concentrated expression she used before diving into cold water. I could almost see her checking the apology for hidden rules. Then she asked one child-sized question. Do you still think that? Kendra's answer came without the long hesitation I remembered from the summer. No. One word was enough. Lila did not hug her. She did not say she forgave her. She nodded, then looked toward the hallway where Owen and Ruby had disappeared. I'm gonna go play. Kendra moved aside. That was the whole conversation. I had imagined this moment so many ways during those first furious weeks. In some versions, Kendra cried. In some, Lila delivered a sentence so perfect everyone understood the lesson. In reality, my 9-year-old accepted the information she wanted and left because there was a game happening without her. I could not have asked for a better ending to that conversation. Kendra remained in the chair after Lila walked away. Her eyes stayed on the hallway. I did not comfort her. I also did not use the moment to punish her. She had apologized without demanding payment. The consequence was that she had to sit with whatever came next. That was part of repair too. Later, the dinner dishes created the final test of the evening without anyone planning it. Marilyn had cooked and Evan had helped serve. When the meal ended, everyone simply carried something into the kitchen. Owen took his plate and 2 empty glasses. Ruby carried her own dish with both hands. Lila picked up her plate. Kendra took the serving bowl, and I carried the salad dish. Marilyn stood near the dishwasher only long enough to stop Ruby from stacking a plate on top of a glass. Near the kitchen doorway, Marilyn dropped 2 cloth napkins. Lila bent automatically and picked them up. For a fraction of a second, the old image flashed through me. A fitted sheet. A 9-year-old on her knees beside someone else's bed. Her name alone on a refrigerator. Then Lila tossed the napkins into the laundry basket and immediately turned toward Owen. You said we were racing outside. He was already heading for the back door. That was before cleanup. You're just scared. Owen opened the door. Cold air spilled into the hallway. Then he ran. Lila stared after him in outrage. That's cheating. She dropped the last napkin and sprinted after him. Ruby followed immediately, yelling that nobody had said where the finish line was. Within seconds, all 3 were outside. Their shoes pounded across Marilyn's back patio. Owen shouted something I could not hear. Lila accused him of changing the rules. Ruby declared herself the winner despite being several yards behind both of them. I stood in the kitchen doorway. Nobody called them back. Their plates were already cleared. Their part was done. Now they were allowed to be children. The cold air carried their laughter inside. 6 months earlier, I had returned from a walk and heard cousins playing while my daughter worked alone. I had thought protecting Lila meant proving she belonged equally inside the family I already had. Now the ordinary choices around me had made the answer simpler. Belonging was not something Kendra could award. Marilyn could distribute by blood, or I could manufacture through enough family time. It showed itself in the rules people lived by. When nobody was making a speech, Marilyn came to stand beside me. She did not comment on the children. Neither did I. Outside, Owen reached the far fence first and immediately claimed victory. Lila argued that he had never established a finish line, and therefore his result was invalid. Ruby arrived several seconds later and announced that, under her own rules, she had won. Their voices overlapped. I smiled. For the first time, nobody had to explain where Lila belonged. The rules already did. And no one at that table had to earn the right to belong before they were allowed to go play.